History is not only made of kings and victories, it is built on shadows, blood, and silence. Beneath the shining palaces and holy cathedrals lie stories of betrayal, forbidden knowledge, and secrets too dark to be written in books. These are the forgotten truths, the plagues that reshaped empires, the conspiracies that brought kingdoms to their knees, and the mysteries still haunting us today. Here on Dark History, we pull back the veil of time to reveal the hidden side of the past. Every story we tell is a step deeper into the darkness, where fact and legend collide, and curiosity is your only torch dot. Welcome to Dark History. If you dare to uncover the secrets the world tried to erase, you are in the right place. Make sure to subscribe. Chapter 1. The Silent Arrival. How the plague began. The Black Death did not come crashing into Europe with a roar. It did not arrive with fire, war, or thunder. It came silently, hidden in the shadows, creeping into ports and markets with the quiet inevitability of a nightmare. To the people of the 14th century, the plague did not have a name at first. It was simply an unknown sickness, strange and terrifying, whispered about in hushed tones as bodies began to fall. But history would later remember it as the Black Death, the most devastating pandemic humanity had ever endured. A force that would shatter societies, reshape religions, and leave scars so deep that we still feel its echoes centuries later. The story begins far from the bustling cities of Europe. The plague is believed to have its origins in the steppes of Central Asia, a land of endless grass and roaming caravans. Here, in the burrows of wild rodents, the bacterium Yersinia lived quietly, sustained by fleas that carried it from one animal to another. For centuries, it remained hidden, a disease of rodents rather than humans, erupting only occasionally in isolated villages. But trade, that ancient network of human ambition, would one day lift it from the wild and place it upon the roads that connected empires. The Silk Road, that shimmering artery of commerce, became the dark pathway for death itself. Merchants traveling from Asia to the Middle East carried more than spices and silks. Their caravans were infested with rats, and rats carried fleas. The fleas, once deprived of their rodent hosts, sought out new blood to feed Anand. In doing so, they leaped from animals to humans. This transition was deadly. Once infected, a human would develop fever, chills, and agonizing swellings in the groin, armpits, and neck, black buboes that gave the plague its terrible name. The infection spread through the bloodstream, turning the skin dark with necrosis, drowning the lungs in bloody coughs, or striking down the victim in a matter of days. It was swift, merciless, and inescapable once it began. By the late 1340s, the plague had already reached the edges of Europe. One of the earliest accounts comes from the trading outpost of Kaffa, a Genoese colony on the coast of the Black Sea. There, in 1346, the Mongol army, besieging the city, found themselves struck down by the mysterious disease. Chroniclers tell us that in desperation, the Mongols used their own misfortune as a weapon. They hurled the bodies of plague victims over the walls of Kaffa, catapulting them into the city. Whether or not this truly happened, the legend endures, a chilling story of biological warfare centuries before the term was ever invented. From Kaffa, Genoese ships fled across the sea, carrying merchants, rats, fleas and the invisible plague back to the ports of Europe. Imagine the scene. A ship gliding silently into the harbor of Messina, Sicily, in 1347. The dockworkers rush to meet it, eager to unload cargo of silk and grain. But as they approach, they see something horrifying. The sailors aboard are dead or dying, their bodies covered with black swellings, their skin blotched and darkened as though poisoned by some cruel alchemy. The city panics. Authorities attempt to push the ships back out to sea, to deny them entry, but it is already too late. The rats scurry ashore, the fleas leap to new hosts, and within days, the city is consumed by disease. From Sicily, the plague spread like fire across a dry forest. Ships carried it north to Genoa, Venice, and Marseille. From these ports, it traveled inland, along trade routes and rivers, through bustling markets and quiet villages. It moved with terrifying speed. No wall was high enough, no moat wide enough, no prayer loud enough to keep it away. In just a few years, it would engulf nearly the entire continent, leaving death in its wake. But to the people who first witnessed its arrival, there was no clear explanation. Medicine of the time was rooted in ancient texts, in the teachings of Galen and Hippocrates. Disease, they believed, came from imbalances in the body's humors or from poisoned air called miasma. Some thought the stars themselves had aligned to unleash this catastrophe, that it was written in the heavens. Others whispered that it was punishment from God, a scourge sent to cleanse humanity of its sins. And when fear turned to desperation, suspicion turned to neighbors. Rumors spread that outsiders, foreigners, travelers, or minority communities were poisoning wells and spreading the disease deliberately. Hatred grew alongside the death toll, and the plague was not only a physical sickness, but a sickness of the human spirit. The silent arrival of the Black Death was not marked by a single scream, but by countless whispers, rumors of ships carrying sickness, of villages struck down overnight, of strange omens in the sky. One could walk into a bustling market in the morning and by nightfall see it empty, its stalls abandoned, its vendors dead or fleeing. The horror lay not only in the deaths themselves, but in the speed and randomness of it all. A child could be laughing one day and gone the next. A priest could deliver a sermon on Sunday and be buried by Wednesday. The air seemed thick with invisible poison, and no one knew where to run. The arrival of the Black Death was the beginning of a transformation so profound that it would change the course of history. It was the start of a storm that would claim nearly half of Europe's population, shatter centuries-old institutions, and redraw the map of society itself. And yet, in its first moments, it was simply a rumor carried by ships, a sickness whispered about in markets, a shadow creeping ever closer. The plague had arrived, silently but surely. Europe stood on the edge of a nightmare, and nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 2. A Ship of Death. The first infected ports. The story of the Black Death's march across Europe can be told through the harbors. Each port city became a doorway for death itself, opening wide and letting in an invisible invader that no one could resist. If Chapter 1 was about the arrival of the plague from Asia, Chapter 2 is about its eruption in the Mediterranean, nightmare that began with a single ship. The year was 1347. The island of Sicily, situated at the crossroads of Mediterranean trade, was a bustling hub of commerce. Genoese merchants, with their network spanning from Constantinople to Spain, often docked in its harbors. But one ship that pulled into Messina's port carried a cargo no one expected, death itself, as the vessel drifted in. The people of Messina were horrified. The sailors were covered in boils, their skin blotched with black patches. Some were coughing blood, while others lay lifeless on the deck. This was no ordinary illness. The authorities ordered the ship out of the harbor immediately, trying to deny the sickness entry, but it was already too late. The rats had already scurried down the ropes, the fleas had already bitten new hosts, and Messina was doomed. Panic spread faster than the plague itself. The citizens of Messina fled the city in terror, seeking refuge in the countryside. But all they did was carry the disease with them, scattering it like sparks into dry grass. Wherever they ran, the plague followed. Entire villages would vanish in weeks. Fields went untended, markets were abandoned, and churches filled with the dead and dying. From Sicily, the plague spread northward. Ships sailed to Genoa and Venice, two of the wealthiest cities in Italy. There, in the glittering palaces of merchants and the narrow alleys of the poor, the sickness found equal victims. No wealth, no social rank, no fortress walls could protect against it. In Venice, entire households were struck down, their doors marked with painted crosses to warn others of the contagion within. Gondolas carried not lovers, but corpses, ferried quietly to mass graves outside the city. Marseille was next. When the first infected ships arrived, the authorities tried to quarantine them. But quarantine, as we understand it today, was a new idea in the 14th century. No one fully grasped how the disease spread. The people believed in poisoned air miasma that drifted invisibly and fatally. They tried to light fires, burn herbs, and ring bells to drive the poison away. But the true culprit was much smaller, carried in the blood of fleas too tiny to be seen. Marseille fell just as quickly, its markets emptying, its harbor silent. From Marseille, the disease spread inland through the Rhine Valley and the trading towns of France. By the end of 1347, the Black Death was no longer a whisper or a rumor. It was an undeniable reality, a wave of death sweeping across Europe's shores. And the ports were only the beginning. What made the plague unstoppable was the very thing that had made Europe so powerful: trade. Ships brought goods, wealth, and ideas, but now they carried death. Merchants carried coins and silks, but also fleas. Soldiers marched with banners and swords, but also carried the sickness to every castle. They entered the same roads that carried pilgrims to holy sites, now carried the plague to every corner of Christendom. And always, the same pattern repeated itself. A ship arrived in harbor, its crew, sick or dead. Panic spread through the city. Some tried to shut their gates, but the rats found their way in. Within days, the city was overwhelmed. Families locked themselves indoors, hoping to survive by isolation, but starvation and sickness claimed them all the same. Priests who braved the houses of the dying often did not return. Doctors, dressed in long robes and strange beaked masks, stuffed with herbs, wandered the streets like shadows, offering little but false hope. In just months, Europe was transforming before its own eyes. The plague had arrived, not as an invading army, but as a stowaway in the holds of ships, and from those ports it would march inland, devouring cities, kingdoms, and empires with terrifying speed. By the end of 1347, it was clear to all, this was no ordinary illness. It was a disaster the likes of which Europe had never seen, and the worst was yet to come. Chapter 3. The human cost, death, despair, and survival. To understand the Black Death is not merely to count the dead, but to hear the echoes of broken voices, to glimpse the fear carved into the faces of survivors, and to feel the weight of silence that fell across Europe. Behind every statistic of millions lost lay individual stories: mothers clutching children as they coughed their last breaths, fathers digging hurried graves, lovers separated by fever, and priests chanting prayers over piles of corpses instead of souls one by one. This chapter is not about the disease as numbers, it is about the human cost, the agony and endurance that turned the Black Death into not just a pandemic, but an event that scarred the very soul of a continent. Imagine a village in rural France in 1348. The harvest is rich, the fields golden, children laugh as they chase one another through the meadows, and the local church prepares for a feast day. Then, within weeks, everything changes. A farmer returns from the market coughing, his skin flushed with fever. Within days, his wife and sons are infected. Their neighbors come to help, but soon they too fall ill. By the end of the month, the once lively village is reduced to a handful of survivors, wandering among empty cottages, the silence heavier than any bell toll. The suddenness of death was perhaps its most terrifying aspect. People who were strong and healthy at dawn could be laid out for burial by dusk. Chroniclers tell us of men collapsing in the marketplace, of women struck down at the loom, of priests fainting at the altar. For many, it seemed death no longer crept, it pounced. Life was fragile before, but the plague shattered any illusion of security. The physical suffering was horrifying to behold. Victims developed fevers so hot they raved in delirium, their skin covered with black blotches, their lymph nodes swelling into grotesque, painful buboes. These boils, found in the armpits, neck, and groin, sometimes grew to the size of an apple, bursting with foul-smelling pus. The smell of death clung to households long after the bodies were gone. Some victims bled from the nose and mouth, coughing up crimson until their lungs failed. Too many witnesses, it seemed less a sickness and more a curse upon mankind. Families bore the heaviest burden. Parents faced the unimaginable choice of whether to tend to their sick children, knowing they too might perish, or abandon them in the faint hope of survival. Some clung to one another until the end, entire households wiped out in each other's arms. Others fractured under the pressure, with husbands fleeing wives, mothers leaving infants to starve, and children turning from dying parents. Not all did so out of cowardice. Many simply could not bear the sight of so much suffering, or they feared spreading the infection further. The plague tested love itself, and in countless cases, it broke. Yet not every story was one of despair. There were also moments of extraordinary courage. Priests, though many perished, continued to anoint the sick and pray over the dying. Physicians, though powerless, risked their lives to tend to patients. Neighbors dug graves for those abandoned, ensuring some dignity in death. Even in the face of overwhelming mortality, sparks of humanity endured. These rare acts of selflessness shone, like fragile candles in a storm of darkness. Burial itself became one of the greatest challenges. Traditional funerals, with prayers, processions, and blessings, became impossible. The sheer number of corpses overwhelmed every community. Graveyards overflowed, and mass pits were dug, where bodies were stacked layer upon layer, sprinkled with lime, and covered hastily with earth. Priests, who would normally preside over burials, were themselves dying in droves. In many places, the ritual of death was abandoned entirely. To die in silence, without ceremony, was perhaps the cruelest wound of all in a deeply religious age, where salvation and remembrance were everything. The trauma of loss echoed in every corner of society. Survivors spoke of walking through empty streets where doors hung open, the hearths cold, and silence lingered like a ghost. Children grew up with no parents, entire lineages erased in a matter of weeks. Towns lost their leaders, villages their elders, monasteries their abbots. The collective wisdom of generations was cut down with frightening speed, and yet, somehow, life had to continue. Crops still needed harvesting, animals still needed care, and the living still needed food. The survivors bore not just grief, but the crushing responsibility of carrying on in a world stripped bare. One of the most haunting aspects of the plague was the randomness of survival. Two households side by side might face utterly different fates, one obliterated, the other left untouched. Children who lost entire families sometimes endured, while strong men and women perished overnight. To medieval minds, this randomness was bewildering, feeding superstitions and fears. Was it God's punishment? Was it witchcraft? Was it the stars themselves condemning humanity? The lack of answers only deepened the despair. Psychologically, the Black Death carved deep scars. Survivors often lived with guilt. Why had they been spared, while loved ones perished? Communities that once shared joy now shared suspicion. In cities, neighbors closed their doors tightly, treating one another as potential threats. Trust collapsed. Fear of strangers grew. Even after the waves of plague passed, the fear lingered. Children born in its shadow grew up with tales of horror that shaped their worldview, passing the trauma to future generations. Art and literature also absorbed this pain. Writers like Boccaccio in Italy and chroniclers across Europe recorded not just the facts, but the emotions, the terror, the loneliness, the despair. Art shifted toward darker themes, with skeletons, skulls, and grim imagery dominating church walls and manuscripts. The famous Danse Macabre, the Dance of Death, emerged in this era, reminding all that death spared no one, neither king nor peasant, priest nor sinner. This grim motif would endure for centuries, a haunting echo of the plague's impact on the human spirit. But even in the shadow of despair, resilience flickered. Survivors adapted, communities reorganized. Children orphaned by the plague were taken in by relatives or monasteries. Farmers returned to fields, sometimes merging abandoned lands into larger holdings. Trade resumed slowly, driven by the need for survival. Humanity endured, scarred but not destroyed. The human cost of the Black Death cannot be measured in numbers alone. It must be felt in the silence of abandoned villages, in the weeping of widows, in the hollow eyes of children, and in the whispered prayers of survivors who had seen too much. It was a world where life and death became neighbors, and where every heartbeat was a fragile defiance against the darkness. And yet, out of this suffering, something unexpected began to grow. For in the ashes of despair, change was brewing. Society itself was being reshaped by the trauma economically, socially, and spiritually. What had been lost could never return, but what emerged would alter the very course of history. Chapter 4. Paris, the city of scholars, drowns in plague. In the 14th century, Paris was the beating heart of medieval Europe. With its grand cathedral of Notre Dame, bustling markets, and the famous University of Paris, the city was not only the capital of the French kingdom, but also the intellectual and cultural capital of Christendom. Scholars from all across Europe came here to study philosophy, medicine, and theology, believing Paris to be the crown jewel of learning and progress. But in 1348, all of that brilliance dimmed beneath the suffocating shadow of the Black Death. The plague entered France along the Mediterranean coast, spreading from Marseille up through Avignon and then into the Rhine Valley. By the time it reached Paris, the city had already heard terrifying reports. Entire villages in Provence wiped out, noble families in Avignon reduced to corpses, and even Pope Clement VI barricaded in his palace, surrounded by fires meant to purifying the air. But hearing about the plague and facing it were two very different things. Paris was a crowded city, its narrow streets packed with merchants, students, clergy, and commoners. Its filthy alleys, lack of sanitation, and constant movement of people made it a perfect breeding ground for the disease. When the first cases appeared, panic spread as quickly as the infection. Victims were struck down with fevers, blackened buboes, and bloody coughing fits. Within days, whole households vanished, leaving their doors bolted from the outside, with only silence inside. The University of Paris, once the most respected seat of learning in Europe, became a scene of chaos and confusion. Physicians debated furiously over the cause of the sickness. Some argued it came from poisoned air, others from planetary alignments, and still others blamed sin and divine wrath. The university even issued an official statement declaring that a rare conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345 had poisoned the Earth's atmosphere, unleashing the plague. These explanations did little to stop the dying. Religious leaders offered prayers and processions, but these too often made things worse. Huge crowds of worshippers gathered in the streets, hoping to beg God's mercy, only to spread the disease further. Priests themselves were among the first to fall, leaving many parishes without spiritual guidance. In desperation, the faithful turned to extreme measures. The flagellants, whipping themselves bloody in public to atone for humanity's sins, appeared in Paris, attracting both awe and horror. As corpses piled up, the Parisian authorities struggled to keep order. Cemeteries overflowed, and mass graves had to be dug outside the city walls. Chroniclers describe how carts loaded with the dead rolled daily through the streets, the smell of decay hanging over the entire city. At night, the silence was broken, only by the wheels of these carts and the cries of the dying echoing from shuttered homes. The plague struck rich and poor alike. Nobles fled the city to their country estates, but many found no safety there. Merchants and bankers tried to continue business, but with trade collapsing and ships no longer arriving, Paris soon fell into economic ruin. Food grew scarce, prices soared, and riots erupted in the markets. The city that had once been the wealthiest in France was brought to its knees. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Parisian plague was the destruction of its intellectual community. Scholars who had debated philosophy in the lecture halls of the Sorbonne were now corpses in mass graves. Students who had traveled hundreds of miles to study in Paris found themselves stranded in a city of death. Knowledge, the very life of Paris, could not defend against the invisible enemy. The plague also ignited paranoia and hatred. Jews, lepers, and other marginalized groups were accused of poisoning wells or conspiring to spread the sickness. In Paris, as in many other European cities, this led to brutal pogroms. Entire Jewish communities were massacred, burned alive, or driven out, their deaths adding to the tally of horror. Historians now know these accusations were false, but in the fear of the moment, reason was abandoned, and innocent lives were destroyed. By 1349, Paris was transformed into a city of mourning. It is estimated that perhaps half of its population perished. Streets once filled with scholars, merchants, and pilgrims became silent corridors of grief. Notre Dame's bells tolled endlessly, not in celebration but in mourning for the endless dead. Chroniclers wrote of the eerie emptiness once crowded lecture halls, now abandoned, professors buried in common graves, and students wandering aimlessly, their futures erased. And yet, from this catastrophe, seeds of change began to grow. With so many priests dead, the church's authority was shaken. With so many nobles gone, commoners began to demand more rights. The universities, though battered, would eventually rebound, and in time Paris would once again rise as a center of knowledge. But during those dark months of plague, the city of scholars was brought lower than anyone could have imagined, drowning in pestilence, despair, and fire. The plague had no favorites. It struck the scholar's pen and the merchant's coin with equal cruelty. Paris, the proud jewel of Europe, was reduced to ash and shadow, its great mind silenced, its beauty scarred. The Black Death had carved its mark upon the heart of France, and the scars would never fade. Chapter 5. England under the shadow, the Black Death across the Channel. The year was 1348, when the shadow of the Black Death crept across the English Channel. England, a kingdom that had grown confident under the rule of Edward III, was unprepared for the storm about to descend. The war with France, the early stages of what we now call the 100 Years' War, was already draining the country's resources, but no battlefield would compare to the invisible enemy now making its way toward English shores. It began quietly, almost deceptively, in the summer of that year. Merchants and sailors traveling from Normandy brought with them not just cargo but the seeds of catastrophe. The first outbreak was reported in the port city of Melcombe Regis, modern-day Weymouth in Dorset. From there, like wildfire, it spread inland, carried by rats, fleas, and human contact. England, with its network of bustling trade routes, thriving markets, and dense towns, was the perfect host for the plague's arrival. The people of England, much like those in France and Italy, had already heard rumors of the pestilence. Tales from across the Channel spoke of corpses piled high in the streets of Paris, of mass graves in Avignon, and of whole families wiped out in Florence. But for most, these accounts were distant, almost mythical in their horror. When the plague finally arrived on English soil, those distant nightmares became a brutal reality. By autumn, the disease had reached Bristol, one of England's largest ports. Chroniclers described the speed with which it devastated the city. Within days of its arrival, thousands fell sick, and in a short time the city was in despair. Merchants, long the lifeblood of Bristol's economy, shut their shops. Ships in the harbour rotted, their crews either dead or too fearful to unload goods. Bristol, a hub of commerce, was silenced. From there, the pestilence spread like a dark tide, rolling northward and eastward, consuming town after town. Gloucester, Oxford, and then, most terrifyingly, London. London in 1348 was a city of contrasts. Magnificent churches like St. Paul's, crowded markets at Cheapside, and filthy, narrow lanes where refuse piled up and pigs wandered freely. It was home to perhaps 80,000 souls, making it the largest city in England, but its size and density were also its curse. Once the plague entered London, there was no containing it. Eyewitnesses described scenes of chaos. Priests could not keep up with the endless demand for last rites. The dead lay unburied in homes until carts came to carry them away. Cemeteries filled so quickly that new burial grounds had to be consecrated outside the city walls. The churchyard of St. Mary's at East Smithfield became one of the most infamous plague pits, where layer upon layer of corpses were stacked like cordwood. Archaeological excavations centuries later would uncover these mass graves, a grim reminder of the horror. The wealthy tried to flee. Nobles and merchants abandoned their houses in the city, retreating to their country estates in the hope of safety. But the plague was no respecter of walls or wealth. It followed them along the roads, carried by servants, animals, or even the very clothes they wore. Those who thought themselves safe often found death waiting at their manor gates. The monarchy itself was not untouched. King Edward III, though spared from infection, was horrified by the devastation. Chroniclers note that in 1349 he wrote to the mayor of London, lamenting how a great mortality of men and other animals, within the realm of England and other realms and lands, was tearing apart the very fabric of society. Even the king's daughter, Princess Joan, fell victim. She was engaged to Pedro of Castile, and had travelled to Bordeaux for her betrothal when she contracted the plague. At just 14 years old, she was dead before her marriage could take place. Her death was a chilling reminder that even royalty was powerless. England's countryside fared no better than its cities. Villages that had stood for centuries were suddenly abandoned. Fields went untilled, crops rotted, and livestock wandered unattended. Whole communities disappeared, leaving only ruins behind. In some regions, it is said that 9 out of 10 people perished. The English landscape was scarred, dotted with ghost villages whose names faded from memory. Religious explanations abounded. Many saw the plague as divine punishment for sin. Flagellants appeared, though not as widespread in England as on the continent, publicly whipping themselves in attempts to appease God's wrath. The Church, overwhelmed by death, struggled to maintain its authority. Monasteries, often centers of healing and charity, were struck particularly hard. Entire monastic communities were wiped out, their libraries abandoned, their prayers silenced. The plague also ignited darker impulses. In England, Jews had already been expelled decades earlier by Edward I, so scapegoating them was less prevalent than in continental Europe. Instead, suspicion fell on other marginalized groups, such as lepers and foreigners. Rumors spread of poisoned wells, curses, and witchcraft. Fear bred cruelty, and in many towns, innocent people were persecuted. Economically, the devastation was staggering. With so many dead, labor shortages crippled the feudal system. Fields lay barren, and lords struggled to find peasants to till the soil. Survivors, however, suddenly found themselves in a position of power. Wages rose as workers could now demand more for their labor. The old order of feudal obligation began to crack, sowing seeds that would, in time, contribute to profound social change. The impact on culture and thought was equally profound. Art became obsessed with death, as seen in the rise of the Danse Macabre, depictions of skeletons leading the living to their graves. Literature, too, absorbed the trauma, with writers recording not only the despair, but also the strange resilience of humanity. The plague had become not just a physical reality, but a psychological wound on the soul of the nation. By 1350, the worst wave of the plague in England had subsided, but the kingdom was forever changed. Estimates suggest that between 1/3 and 1/2 of England's population perished. The silence left behind was deafening. Villages empty, churches deserted, schools closed, and countless families extinguished. And yet, from this destruction, new realities emerged. Survivors inherited land and wealth from the dead. Peasants began to challenge their lords, demanding fairer treatment and higher pay. The rigid social hierarchy of medieval England was shaken to its core. It would not collapse immediately, but the Black Death planted the seeds of rebellion and transformation. Within decades, England would witness the peasants' revolt, an uprising fueled in part by the labor dynamics forged in the plague years. England had endured famine, war, and political turmoil before, but never anything like the Black Death. The pestilence reshaped not only its demography, but its very identity. From the ashes of death came the faint stirrings of change, but in 1348 to 1350, the English knew only grief. In the whispers of the plague carts, the tolling of the church bells, and the eerie silence of abandoned villages, they lived through an apocalypse that seemed to have no end. The Black Death had not only crossed the Channel, it had carved its name into the very soul of England. Chapter 6. The Plague in the Countryside. Ghost Villages of Europe. When people imagine the Black Death, their minds often turn to the crowded streets of Florence, the alleys of Paris, or the bustling markets of London urban centres where the plague spread with terrifying speed. But the countryside, the heart of medieval Europe, where the majority of people lived, was no safer. In fact, the plague may have cut deeper here, leaving scars still visible centuries later, in the form of deserted villages, abandoned farmlands, and broken communities. The countryside was the backbone of medieval life. Peasants, bound to the land through the rigid structures of feudalism, labored daily to feed their lords and themselves. Villages dotted the European landscape, small clusters of cottages surrounding fields, a parish church, and perhaps a manor house. Life followed the rhythm of the seasons, planting, tending, harvesting, and enduring the cold of winter. This was a world of routine, faith, and hard work, a world that seemed eternal. But the plague shattered that illusion. The disease often reached rural areas after devastating nearby towns, or through the movement of merchants, clergy, or soldiers. Once it arrived, isolation offered little protection. The cramped cottages of peasants, often shared with livestock, provided fertile ground for the fleas and rats that carried the pestilence. Few had the means to flee, and so entire villages found themselves trapped in the path of the invisible killer. Chroniclers tell us that in some rural regions, mortality was even higher than in cities. Cities, for all their filth and density, sometimes allowed a small chance of escape. One might flee to the countryside or lock oneself in behind stone walls, but peasants rarely had options. Bound to the land and unable to travel far, they faced the full fury of the plague with little recourse but prayer. And when the plague struck, its impact was catastrophic. But across England, France, Germany, and Italy, countless villages were abandoned. Some were wiped out completely, every inhabitant dead or fled. Others dwindled to such a degree that they could no longer sustain themselves. Fields went untilled, mills stood silent, and churches fell into ruin. Archaeologists and historians have documented these lost villages. In England alone, records suggest that over 1,000 villages were deserted in the wake of the Black Death. Names, once inscribed in tax rolls and church registers, vanished, swallowed by time. One such example is the village of Warham Percy in Yorkshire, now a famous archaeological site. While its decline stretched over centuries, the Black Death dealt it a decisive blow. Excavations reveal that after the mid-14th century, the population collapsed, buildings decayed, and the once thriving community dwindled into silence. Similar stories unfolded across the continent, leaving behind ghost villages that serve as silent witnesses to the plague's devastation. The countryside's desolation was not just demographic but spiritual. For peasants, the village church was the center of life, the place where baptisms, marriages, and funerals marked the passage of generations. But during the plague, churches often became places of horror. Priests, overwhelmed by the dead and dying, sometimes abandoned their flocks. In many cases, entire parish communities were left without clergy, their spiritual shepherds struck down by the same pestilence. The tolling of church bells, once a familiar part of rural soundscapes, gave way to silence. The impact on agriculture was immense. With so many peasants dead, fields lay fallow, grain rotted, orchards went untended, and herds dwindled. Lords who had once relied on a steady stream of labor found themselves unable to collect rents or enforce obligations. Some attempted to impose harsh measures, demanding that survivors continue their duties. Others were forced to concede to peasant demands for higher wages or better conditions. The social contract of feudalism, already strained, began to crack. The countryside's decline also affected the nobility. Manors, once the symbols of lordly power, became useless without peasants to till the land. Some lords abandoned their estates entirely, retreating to cities or castles, where they hoped to find safety. The great manorial system, which had dominated Europe for centuries, began to unravel under the weight of demographic collapse. Yet the countryside was not only a place of despair, was also a cradle of resilience. Those who survived found themselves in a new world. With land plentiful and labor scarce, peasants could demand freedoms unimaginable before. Some gained access to property. Others secured wages that lifted them out of abject poverty. In England, this shift would lay the foundation for the eventual end of serfdom, though not without resistance from the nobility. Still, the transition was far from smooth. Tensions flared between peasants and lords. In France, the weakened countryside became a target for mercenary bands who roamed the land looting and pillaging. In England, labor laws such as the Ordinance of Labourers 1349 and the Statute of Labourers 1351 sought to freeze wages and tie workers back to the land, provoking anger. The memory of the Black Death lingered in these conflicts, erupting decades later in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Ghost villages were not merely abandoned settlements, they were symbols of a Europe in transition. Walking through their ruins today, one can imagine the lives once lived there, the laughter of children in the fields, the toll of the village bell, the smell of bread baking in cottage ovens, all of it erased in the space of months, victims of a plague that cared nothing for tradition or toil. What makes these ghost villages haunting is the sense of interrupted stories. Unlike cities, which often rebuilt and adapted, many rural communities were simply erased. Their names survive only in old documents, their churches crumbled, their graves overgrown. They are reminders that the Black Death was not just an urban catastrophe, was a rural apocalypse, one that reshaped Europe's very landscape by 1350, when the first wave of the plague receded. The European countryside looked like a battlefield, dotted with empty homes and overgrown fields. Survivors must have walked these abandoned lanes with a profound sense of dread, knowing that the life they had known, the village community, the stable cycle of agricultural toil, was gone forever. And yet, in the silence of ghost villages, seeds of a new Europe were sown. The collapse of old systems gave rise to new freedoms, the end of one world making space for another. But in those first years, all that peasants could see was loss, of family, of community, of everything familiar. The countryside, once the heart of medieval stability, had become a graveyard of dreams. The Black Death had left its mark on the fields of Europe, not only in the bodies buried there, but in the absence of voices, of ploughs, of songs sung at harvest time. The silence of ghost villages was the sound of a continent undone. Chapter 7. The Collapse of Faith. Religion, in the time of plague 4 centuries. The Catholic Church had been the anchor of medieval life. It shaped how people viewed the world, explained the mysteries of life and death, and bound communities together through ritual and belief. When the Black Death struck, however, that anchor began to shatter. Faith, once an unshakable foundation, was thrown into chaos. In the shadow of mass death, people turned desperately to God, and, when answers didn't come, many began to question whether God was listening at all. Imagine yourself as a villager in the year 1348. The plague has just reached your town. Neighbors fall sick, their bodies covered in blackened buboes. Priests lead processions, swinging incense, chanting prayers, urging everyone to confess sins before it is too late. The church bells toll constantly, marking funerals day after day, until their sound becomes unbearable. You pray for mercy, but the plague does not stop. Instead, it grows worse. Even the priests begin to die. Where is God now? The church taught that disasters were punishments for sin. This belief was deeply ingrained, and in the early days of the plague many accepted it. Sermons declared that humanity's wickedness had angered God, and the only solution was repentance. Penitential processions swept through towns, with barefoot men and women carrying candles, scourging themselves and begging for forgiveness. But as the death toll rose, doubts began to creep in. If the plague was punishment, why did the innocent die alongside the guilty? Why did entire convents and monasteries, communities devoted to prayer, fall silent under the pestilence? In some towns, clergy mortality was even higher than the general population, because priests exposed themselves by ministering to the dying. In places like Florence, records show that over half of the city's clergy perished. For ordinary people, this raised a terrifying question. If even God's servants were not spared, what hope was there for anyone? The crisis of faith took many forms. Some people clung more tightly to religion, convinced that only extreme devotion could save them. The movement of the flagellants emerged during the Black Death. Groups of men who wandered from town to town, beating themselves with whips until their backs were raw and bleeding, reenacting Christ's suffering in the hope of earning divine mercy. Crowds gathered to watch, weeping and chanting prayers, convinced that these acts could turn aside God's wrath. For a time the flagellants inspired awe, but eventually the church condemned them as heretical, fearing their chaotic rituals and rejection of clerical authority. Others turned their fear and rage against scapegoats. Rumors spread that the plague was caused not by God's wrath but by human malice. Jews, long marginalized and mistrusted, became targets. Accused of poisoning wells or conspiring to destroy Christendom, Jewish communities faced horrific violence. In towns across Germany, Switzerland, and Spain, pogroms erupted. Entire Jewish quarters were burned, their inhabitants massacred or driven out. These persecutions revealed how fragile the bonds of faith and community had become. Fear had eroded compassion, and faith turned into fanaticism. For many survivors, the plague permanently altered their relationship with the church. Some grew cynical. They had seen priests fleeing their duties, bishops locking themselves in castles, and monasteries collapsing under the weight of death. The church, which promised spiritual protection, had seemed powerless in the face of disease. Trust was broken. Others turned to superstition, charms, astrology, and folk magic, seeking answers outside the rigid structures of Christian doctrine. This spiritual disillusionment was not universal, but it was widespread enough to leave lasting marks. Scholars argue that the Black Death weakened the unquestioned authority of the church, opening cracks that centuries later would widen into the Protestant Reformation. Seeds of doubt planted in the 14th century bore fruit in the 16th. When entire nations broke from Rome. At the same time, art and literature reflected the collapse of faith. Before the plague, medieval art often depicted heavenly order and divine harmony. Afterward, grim new themes emerged. Murals of the Dance of Death, Danse Macabre, appeared in churches across Europe, showing skeletons leading kings, priests, and peasants alike to the grave. These haunting images reminded viewers that death spared no one, not the pious, not the powerful. The message was stark. The world was no longer a place of stability, but a place where death could strike at any moment. Writers also gave voice to doubt. In Florence, Giovanni Boccaccio wrote the Decameron, describing how people fled the city and abandoned all notions of morality. He observed how priests died like everyone else, how rituals failed, and how fear broke society apart. His stories reveal a world where traditional religious explanations no longer satisfied human longing for answers. The collapse of faith was not just theological, it was emotional. For people who had believed deeply that God's will governed every detail of life, the plague was a shattering trauma. Imagine standing in a churchyard surrounded by mass graves, watching priests throw quick handfuls of earth over corpses because there was no time for proper funerals. Imagine seeing your parish priest, the man who baptized you, married your parents, and promised to pray for your soul lying in the same pit as beggars and thieves. The emotional weight of this was crushing, and yet faith did not vanish. For some, the horror of the plague deepened devotion, though in darker forms. The obsession with death led to new rituals, prayers to saints, and pilgrimages to holy sites. The cult of saints who were believed to protect against plague such as Saint Roch and Saint Sebastian spread widely. In art, Sebastian was often depicted pierced with arrows, his suffering symbolizing the wounds of plague victims. People clung to these images as fragile shields against despair. The plague reshaped the church itself. With so many clergy dead, parishes scrambled to replace priests, standards lowered. Men with little training or moral character were rushed into service, weakening the spiritual quality of the church's leadership. This contributed to corruption, which critics would later denounce, but it also created opportunities for ordinary believers to take greater roles in spiritual life, fostering new movements of lay piety. Looking back, the collapse of faith during the Black Death was not total, it was transformation. The church survived, but it was changed. The blind trust of the early Middle Ages gave way to a more skeptical, more questioning faith. People still sought meaning, but they no longer accepted easy answers. The Black Death did what no theologian or philosopher could do. It forced millions to confront the fragility of their beliefs. It shook the foundations of the most powerful institution in medieval Europe. It revealed the limits of faith in the face of suffering, and it left behind a legacy of doubt and searching that would echo through centuries. Chapter 8. The economic aftermath. Wealth in the wake of death. The Black Death was not just a biological disaster, was an economic earthquake. When nearly half of Europe's population perished, the entire structure of medieval society trembled. Fields lay fallow, workshops closed, trade routes emptied, and the intricate balance of labor, wealth, and power shifted in ways no one could have predicted. What began as catastrophe ended up reshaping Europe's economic future, setting the stage for profound transformations that would eventually lead to the end of feudalism and the dawn of a new age. Imagine a bustling medieval village before the plague. The fields are alive with peasants working under the hot sun, producing grain and tending livestock for their lords. Blacksmiths hammer away in the forges, bakers prepare bread for the market, merchants bring spices and cloth from distant lands. Life is not easy. Peasants labor long hours under the burden of rents and taxes, but the system is stable. Everyone has a place, from the lowliest serf to the wealthiest noble. Now picture that same village after the Black Death sweeps through. The fields are silent, the cottages abandoned, the forge cold. Half the villagers are gone. Entire families have disappeared, their houses boarded up or left to crumble. The lord of the manor, once surrounded by dozens of laborers, now finds only a handful left. His crops rot in the fields because there is no one to harvest them. Suddenly, the old system doesn't work anymore. This is where the true economic revolution begins. With so many dead, labor becomes scarce, and that scarcity gives survivors power they never had before. Peasants, once bound to the land and subject to their lord's will, now discover they have leverage. Lords are desperate for workers. Fields must be plowed, herds must be tended, and rents must be collected. But there aren't enough hands to do the work. So peasants begin demanding better conditions, higher wages, lower rents, and even freedom from traditional obligations. In some places, they simply walk away from their manors, knowing they can find better opportunities elsewhere. The result is a dramatic rise in wages across Europe. Historical records show that in England, for example, wages for agricultural workers nearly doubled in the decades after the plague. Craftsmen and artisans in towns also saw their incomes rise, because their skills were suddenly in short supply. For ordinary people, this was one of the few silver linings of the Black Death. For the first time, they could bargain for a better life. But the ruling elite did not accept this easily. Kings and nobles, alarmed by the growing demands of peasants and workers, tried to clamp down. In England, King Edward III issued the Ordinance of Labourers 1349, and later the Statute of Labourers 1351. laws that made it illegal to pay workers more than pre-plague wages, or for peasants to leave their lords' estates. Similar restrictions were attempted across Europe, but enforcement was nearly impossible. With labor so scarce, landowners had no choice but to compete for workers, offering better terms despite the laws. The old order was unraveling. This economic tension soon exploded into rebellion. In 1381, England witnessed the Peasants' Revolt, a massive uprising fueled by anger at oppressive laws, high taxes, and feudal obligations. Led by figures like Wat Tyler, peasants marched on London, demanding freedom and fair treatment. Though the revolt was eventually crushed, it revealed the deep cracks in the feudal system, cracks created by the Black Death. Similar revolts erupted in France, the Jacquerie, and other regions, each fueled by the same dynamic: ordinary people realizing their worth in a world desperate for labor. Beyond the villages, towns and cities also felt the shock. Many urban industries collapsed when their workers died, but those that survived soon flourished. With fewer people to share resources, survivors inherited wealth, property, and businesses. A poor craftsman who once lived on the edge of poverty might suddenly inherit his uncle's workshop, his neighbor's tools, and his cousin's house. Entire fortunes changed hands in a single generation. The result was the rise of a new middle class, made up of merchants, artisans, and professionals who took advantage of the economic reshuffling. Trade also shifted. Some routes, especially overland ones, suffered decline as depopulated towns shrank or vanished. But maritime trade eventually rebounded, with survivors seeking luxury goods and new markets. In places like Italy, cities such as Venice and Genoa adapted quickly, maintaining their dominance as trading hubs. In the long run, the Black Death did not destroy commerce, it restructured it. One of the most profound changes was in land use. With fewer peasants available, lords found it difficult to maintain large, labor-intensive grain fields. Instead, many shifted to less labor-demanding activities, such as sheep farming. Wool became one of Europe's most valuable commodities, fueling the textile industry in places like Flanders and Florence. This shift not only altered the rural economy, but also laid the groundwork for Europe's later economic expansion. Even the way wealth was spent changed. Survivors of the plague, haunted by death, often indulged in what some historians call consumption of despair. People who inherited property or money sometimes spent lavishly on fine clothing, feasts, and art, reasoning that life was short and uncertain. This surge in consumerism fueled growth in urban economies and helped fund cultural movements that would eventually blossom into the Renaissance. But the redistribution of wealth also created resentment. Nobles who lost laborers and income struggled to maintain their lifestyles. Some went bankrupt, forced to sell land or titles. This allowed wealthy townsmen and merchants to purchase estates, blurring the line between nobility and commoners. In time, the rigid class distinctions of medieval society weakened, replaced by a more fluid, more competitive social order. It's important to remember that these economic shifts were not uniform across Europe. In some regions, especially Eastern Europe, landlords responded to labor shortages not by loosening control, but by tightening it. Serfdom actually deepened in places like Poland and Russia, as nobles bound peasants more tightly to the land to prevent them from leaving. This divergence between East and West would shape Europe's future for centuries. The psychological impact of the economic changes was just as important as the financial. Survivors of the plague lived with a new sense of possibility. They had seen the old order collapse, and they knew it could be challenged again. For peasants, this meant a growing awareness of their rights and power. For merchants and townsmen, it meant ambition to climb higher on the social ladder. For nobles, it meant fear of rebellion, fear of losing their status, fear of a world they could no longer control. The Black Death was thus not only a tragedy, but also a turning point. By killing millions, it broke the chains of feudalism, redistributed wealth, and shifted power toward the lower classes. It created turmoil, yes, but also opportunity. Without the plague, the economic structures of medieval Europe might have endured much longer. With it, change became inevitable. Historians often describe the Black Death as the Great Leveler. Death did not discriminate between kings and peasants, and in its aftermath, neither did opportunity. The survivors of Europe found themselves in a new world, where the old rules no longer applied. Out of the ashes of tragedy rose a society that was richer, more dynamic, and more restless than before. The plague had destroyed lives, but it had also created the conditions for transformation. Chapter 9. The Transformation of Medicine. Searching for a cure. When the Black Death descended upon Europe, it struck not only bodies but also beliefs. Medicine in the 14th century was a mixture of ancient theories, superstition, and religious ritual. Doctors studied the works of Galen and Hippocrates, physicians of ancient Greece and Rome whose teachings had dominated for over 1,000 years. Disease, they believed, came from imbalances in the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If these fluids were out of balance, the body became sick. Treatments included bleeding, purging, or applying strange concoctions of herbs and minerals. But the Black Death challenged all of this. It spread too quickly, killed too brutally, and defied every known remedy. No amount of bleeding or herbal poultices seemed to stop it. Physicians were baffled, priests were helpless, and ordinary people lost faith in the medical wisdom of the time. Imagine being a doctor in Florence. In 1348, you were called to the bedside of a young merchant's wife, feverish and covered in painful swellings. To examine her, consult your medical texts, and prescribe the usual treatment: sletches, a potion of ground emerald, perhaps even dried toad powder. Within days, she is dead. Her family soon follows. As you leave their home, neighbors are already whispering, "The doctor has no answers." The failure of medicine during the plague was not only humiliating but devastating. Across Europe, physicians died alongside their patients. Some fled cities altogether, abandoning their profession. Those who stayed often turned to desperate or bizarre remedies. In Paris, doctors recommended avoiding bad air by carrying sweet-smelling herbs, flowers, or vinegar-soaked sponges. In Venice, officials suggested burning aromatic woods to cleanse the air. Some wore elaborate plague doctor outfits: robes coated in wax, gloves, a stick to avoid touching patients, and the iconic bird-like mask stuffed with herbs. To modernize, these costumes look strange, but at the time, they were a serious attempt at protection. One of the most enduring medical theories of the plague was miasma, the belief that disease was spread by poisoned or corrupted air. According to this idea, foul smells carried sickness into the body. The sight of countless corpses rotting in city streets only seemed to confirm it. People lit fires, burned incense, or carried flowers, posies, in hopes of warding off infection. This belief would persist for centuries, influencing medicine well into the 17th and 18th centuries. But there were also glimmers of progress. Some observers began to notice patterns. They saw that the plague spread from person to person, especially in crowded areas, suggesting some form of contagion. Italian physician Gabriele de Musis, for example, wrote about how sailors carried the plague from one port to another, foreshadowing the modern understanding of disease transmission. In Milan, officials ordered the houses of the sick to be sealed, and in Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, authorities introduced quarantino, a 40-day isolation period, for arriving ships. This was the birth of quarantine, a practice still used today, though primitive. These measures showed a crucial shift. Instead of relying solely on ancient texts or religious rituals, people were beginning to observe, record, and adapt. The plague forced Europe to experiment with public health, sanitation, and containment in ways that had never been tried before. Still, superstition remained powerful. Many believed the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins. Religious processions, fasting, and prayer were common, but some turned to more extreme measures. The flagellants were groups of men who wandered from town to town, whipping themselves in public displays of penance. They believed that by inflicting pain on their own bodies, they could atone for the sins that had angered God and caused the plague. Though the church initially tolerated them, their growing popularity and radical practices eventually alarmed authorities, and many were suppressed. Other superstitions turned deadly. Jews were accused of poisoning wells and causing the plague, leading to horrific massacres and expulsions across Europe. In cities like Strasbourg and Mainz, entire Jewish communities were wiped out. These acts of violence revealed how fear and ignorance could twist medical uncertainty into scapegoating and hate. Yet, even in this darkness, seeds of change were being sown. The sheer scale of the Black Death forced Europe to confront the limits of medieval medicine. Universities and medical schools, once content to repeat ancient texts, began slowly shifting toward observation and experimentation. By the 15th century, autopsies became more common, allowing physicians to study the human body directly. This was revolutionary. For centuries, the dissection of corpses had been rare and controversial, but now it became a valuable tool for understanding disease. The Black Death also accelerated the spread of medical knowledge. Survivors sought new explanations, and translations of Arabic medical texts circulated widely. Scholars turned to the works of Islamic physicians like Avicenna and Ibn al-Khatib, whose writings included discussions of contagion and hygiene. This exchange of knowledge broadened Europe's perspective and laid the groundwork for the eventual Renaissance in medicine. Economically, the plague reshaped medicine as well. With physicians in short supply, their fees skyrocketed. Wealthy families competed to hire doctors, while poorer patients turned to local healers, midwives, or herbalists. This democratization of healing meant that medical knowledge spread beyond the universities into the hands of ordinary people who experimented with remedies. Herbal medicine, folk cures, and even charms flourished, blending science, superstition, and tradition. Another consequence was the growing role of public health authorities. City governments, desperate to control outbreaks, began organizing burial teams, building plague hospitals, and enforcing quarantines. This marked the beginning of a partnership between medicine and the state, a relationship that would expand over the centuries. The idea that health was not just an individual concern but a matter of public order was a profound shift born out of necessity. It is important to remember, however, that true scientific understanding of the plague, the fact that it was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas on rats, would not come until centuries later. Still, the crisis sparked questions that pointed medicine in a new direction. Instead of blindly trusting tradition, more physicians began asking, what do we see? What works? What fails? These were the foundations of modern medical thinking. The legacy of the Black Death in medicine was thus paradoxical. On one hand, it revealed the utter weakness of medieval medicine, exposing its reliance on superstition and outdated theories. On the other, it forced innovation, encouraged observation, and introduced practices like quarantine that remain essential to this day. Perhaps the most lasting lesson was humility. For centuries, doctors had claimed authority over health, bolstered by ancient wisdom and the prestige of universities. But the plague humbled them. It showed that nature was far more complex, that disease could strike down rich and poor alike, and that knowledge must constantly evolve. This humbling was painful, but it was also necessary. It cracked open the door to the Renaissance, and, eventually, to modern science. The Black Death did not just kill millions, it transformed how humans understood the body, disease, and health itself. Out of despair came discovery. Out of failure came the first steps toward progress. Chapter 10. Faith and Fear. The Church under siege. The Black Death did not simply devastate populations, it shook the very foundations of belief. In 14th century Europe, the Catholic Church was more than a religious institution. It was the glue that bound society together. It shaped law, politics, education, morality, and the rhythm of daily life. People believed that the Church was the mediator between humanity and God, the guardian of salvation. But when the plague arrived, killing priests, monks, bishops, and ordinary believers alike, that faith was tested as never before. Imagine the scene: a small village in France, 1348. The parish priest, beloved by his flock, prays over the sick, administers last rites, and buries the dead. Within a week, he too is dead, followed by his assistant and the monks who cared for the local abbey. Suddenly, the village has no spiritual guide, no one to offer comfort, no one to interpret God's will. For the faithful, it felt as though heaven itself had abandoned them. The Church's initial response was to interpret the plague as divine punishment. Sinful humanity, they said, had angered God, and the disease was his scourge. Priests called for repentance, fasting, pilgrimages, and prayer. Pope Clement VI declared special indulgences for the dying, assuring them that even if priests could not reach them, they would still be absolved of their sins. But the sheer scale of the catastrophe overwhelmed these measures. Monasteries, once seen as sanctuaries, became death traps. Monks lived in close quarters, shared meals, and cared for the sick, making them particularly vulnerable. Entire monastic communities were wiped out. In some regions, over half of the clergy perished. This left a gaping hole in the spiritual leadership of Europe. Worse still, many clergy fled their posts. Terrified of infection, priests abandoned towns, bishops retreated to the countryside, and monks locked themselves away. Ordinary people, left without sacraments or comfort, grew resentful. The authority of the Church, already strained by political rivalries and corruption, suffered a devastating blow. In this vacuum, alternative religious movements flourished. The most famous were the flagellant bands of penitents who roamed from city to city, whipping themselves in public displays of suffering. They believed that by reenacting Christ's pain, they could atone for humanity's sins and end the plague. Crowds gathered to watch their bloody processions, chanting hymns and weeping in repentance. For a time, the flagellants gained enormous popularity, so much so that they began to rival the Church itself. Alarmed by their growing influence and radical practices, Pope Clement VI condemned them in 1349, but their impact on the religious psyche of Europe was lasting. The plague also fueled a surge in superstition and scapegoating. When prayers and rituals failed, people sought someone to blame. Many accused Jews of poisoning wells, spreading the plague deliberately. Despite papal decrees forbidding violence against Jews, pogroms erupted across Europe. In cities like entire Jewish communities were massacred. In others, Jews were expelled, their property confiscated. The Church's inability or unwillingness to fully protect them revealed both its weakening grip and the dangerous power of fear. Meanwhile, within the Church itself, the plague triggered desperation and corruption. With so many priests dead, replacements were hastily appointed, often men with little education or spiritual training. Standards fell. Some clergy exploited the crisis, charging exorbitant fees for last rites, burials, or indulgences. This deepened public anger and suspicion, planting seeds of doubt that would later blossom into the Reformation. Yet it would be unfair to paint the entire Church as cowardly or corrupt. Many priests, monks, and nuns displayed extraordinary courage, tending to the sick and dying despite the risks. In some places, convents became havens of mercy, with nuns nursing the afflicted until they themselves succumbed. Chronicles tell of clergy who walked fearlessly into infected homes, bringing comfort to the dying when no one else would. Their sacrifices, though overshadowed by failures, were a powerful testament to faith in action. One of the most striking consequences of the plague was the rise of personal piety. When the institutional Church faltered, many believers turned inward, seeking direct relationships with God. Mystical movements spread, emphasizing visions, prayers, and private devotion. Writers like Catherine of Siena and Julian of Norwich offered new ways of understanding suffering and divine love. Julian, who survived the plague, famously wrote, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." Her words carried hope amid despair. At the same time, apocalyptic fears surged. Many believed the plague signaled the end of days, foretold in the book of Revelation. Preachers warned of judgment, urging repentance before the final reckoning. This apocalyptic mindset left a deep imprint on art, literature, and spirituality. Skeletons, skulls, and grim reapers filled paintings and church walls, giving rise to the haunting motif of the Danse Macabre, the dance of death. These images reminded all that death spared no one: peasants, kings, priests, or merchants. Politically, the weakening of the Church's authority had profound consequences. Before the plague, the papacy wielded immense power over kings and emperors. But after the devastation, monarchs increasingly asserted independence. They taxed the clergy, seized church lands, and intervened in religious affairs. The slow erosion of papal supremacy had begun, a process that would culminate in the 16th century with Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. The plague also transformed theology itself. Traditional explanations, sin and divine wrath, no longer satisfied many believers. Why would God, who was supposed to be merciful, slaughter the innocent along with the guilty? Why did prayers fail? These questions sowed doubt and pushed thinkers to explore new ideas. Some leaned toward humanism, emphasizing reason, observation, and the dignity of man. Others doubled down on strict religiosity, demanding greater moral reform. Either way, the intellectual landscape of Europe was shifting. Perhaps the most ironic twist is that while the plague weakened the institutional Church, it also made faith more personal and resilient. People no longer relied solely on priests to interpret God's will. They prayed privately, developed new rituals, and clung to hope in the face of devastation. In the long run, this decentralization of faith contributed to a more diverse spiritual culture. The Black Death, then, was both a crisis and a catalyst. It stripped the Church of unquestioned authority, but also inspired new forms of devotion. It revealed corruption and cowardice, but also acts of profound courage. Above all, it forced people to confront the fragility of life and the mystery of suffering. When the bells of churches tolled endlessly for the dead, when processions wound through streets thick with the stench of decay, when priests fell beside their flock, the old certainties crumbled. But in the rubble, new paths of faith emerged, paths that would shape Europe's spiritual journey for centuries. Chapter 11: The Collapse of Order. Law, crime, and chaos in the wake of the plague of Black Death was not only a biological catastrophe, it was also a social earthquake. Medieval Europe had always been precariously balanced between order and chaos, with kings, lords, and the church keeping society in check. But when the plague ripped through towns and villages, killing millions, those fragile structures buckled. With death everywhere, law and justice often disappeared, crime surged, violence became commonplace, and chaos reigned in ways that had not been seen in centuries. Picture the scene: a once thriving marketplace in Florence or London, now eerily quiet, stalls abandoned, the cobblestones littered with refuse. In one corner, bodies await burial, stacked like firewood. The local magistrate, who once presided over disputes, has succumbed to the plague. The city guards have fled or are too weak to enforce order. In this vacuum, opportunists rise: thieves, bandits, and swindlers who prey on the vulnerable. The collapse of authority was immediate and devastating. With officials dead or gone, towns had no one to enforce laws, collect taxes, or organize defenses. Some cities attempted to appoint temporary leaders, but these often lacked legitimacy or power. In many places, justice fell into the hands of mobs. Vigilantism surged, with frightened citizens taking the law into their own hands. One chilling example was the wave of pogroms against Jewish communities. Convinced that Jews had poisoned wells and caused the plague, mobs in Mainz, Cologne, and dozens of other cities slaughtered thousands. These killings were rarely stopped by local rulers. Sometimes, the rulers themselves encouraged them, using chaos as an excuse to seize Jewish wealth and property. In such moments, law and justice evaporated, replaced by superstition and rage. Crime itself took many forms. Looting became rampant. Abandoned houses, shops, and even churches were stripped of valuables. Gangs of thieves roamed the countryside, raiding farms and ambushing travelers. In Italy, records describe entire villages plundered by desperate bands of survivors who justified their crimes as a means of survival. In England, outlaws found fertile ground, their numbers swelling as sheriffs and constables succumbed to the plague. But crime was not limited to the poor and desperate. The wealthy, too, exploited the chaos. Corrupt officials demanded bribes, landlords extorted tenants, and merchants inflated prices. Some doctors charged outrageous fees, promising miracle cures. Others sold fraudulent charms, potions, and relics. In the absence of accountability, greed flourished alongside desperation. At the same time, traditional punishments and courts often ceased to function, with jails overflowing or emptied, as guards abandoned their posts. Criminals frequently went unpunished. In some places, the gallows stood idle, not because there were no crimes, but because executioners were dead or terrified to approach the condemned. Chroniclers tell of thieves and murderers walking free simply because no one was left to try them. The chaos was not limited to towns and cities. In the countryside, banditry surged, with trade disrupted and harvests left to rot. Peasants often found themselves starving. Many turned to theft or violence, raiding nearby estates. Knights and mercenaries, suddenly unemployed as wars paused due to the plague, also turned into predators. They roamed the roads in armed bands, extorting tolls and terrorizing villagers. The psychological toll of the plague also contributed to lawlessness. For many, the omnipresence of death eroded moral boundaries. If tomorrow I die, why not steal today? This fatalistic mindset made crime seem less like a sin and more like a final indulgence. Chroniclers describe drunken revelries, orgies, and wild feasts in the midst of devastation. As people abandoned restraint in the face of oblivion, fear and paranoia further fueled chaos. Neighbors turned against neighbors, accusing one another of witchcraft, heresy, or plague spreading. Rumors sparked lynchings and beatings. Outsiders, beggars, travelers, lepers were often attacked or driven out, scapegoated as carriers of disease. Order dissolved into suspicion, and communities fractured under the weight of fear. Yet, amid this turmoil, some rulers tried to reassert control. In Milan, authorities famously ordered the sealing of plague houses, entombing entire families, to prevent the spread. While brutal, it reflected an attempt to restore discipline. In Venice, strict quarantine laws were introduced, enforced by armed patrols. England's Parliament, though weakened, passed emergency measures to stabilize labor and prevent riots. These early efforts at crisis governance laid the groundwork for modern public health laws, but they also revealed how fragile medieval justice truly was. The collapse of order also brought unexpected social revolutions. With so many lords and officials dead, peasants found themselves freer than before. Many abandoned feudal obligations, refusing to work for their masters or demanding higher wages. This sparked fierce backlash from the elite, who tried to enforce pre-plague wages through harsh laws like England's Statute of Labourers 1351. But enforcement was nearly impossible, and in many regions, workers gained unprecedented bargaining power. This sowed the seeds of later revolts, such as the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Art and literature of the period captured this descent into chaos. The haunting images of the Danse Macabre, showing skeletons dragging kings, priests, and peasants alike to their graves, reflected not just death's universality, but society's collapse. Writers described cities where dogs ate the flesh of men in the streets, and where brother abandoned brother, mother abandoned child. Such accounts, while exaggerated at times, reveal the deep scars left by lawlessness. But perhaps the most significant outcome was the way the plague reshaped the concept of justice itself. Before, justice had been bound tightly to divine order, the idea that laws reflected God's will, enforced by his earthly representatives. After the plague, this certainty crumbled. People saw that priests, judges, and kings could die as easily as commoners, their authority no shield against chaos. Justice, it seemed, was no longer guaranteed by heaven. Instead, it became a matter of human effort. Laws, written by men, enforced by fragile institutions. The Black Death thus left a paradoxical legacy. It unleashed waves of violence, crime, and disorder that terrorized survivors. Yet it also revealed the weakness of old systems, forcing rulers to innovate and societies to adapt. Out of lawlessness came the slow birth of stronger, more centralized states, with new mechanisms of control. The chaos of the 14th century paved the way for the modern age of governance. In the end, the collapse of order was as transformative as the plague itself. The disease killed bodies, but lawlessness killed trust. The trust between neighbors, between ruler and ruled, between humanity and its institutions. And once broken, that trust would take centuries to rebuild. Chapter 12. The changing face of medicine from superstition to science. The Black Death was more than a disease. It was a reckoning for medieval medicine. Before the plague, medical knowledge in Europe was built on fragile foundations. The writings of ancient authorities like Hippocrates and Galen, mixed with astrology, religion, and superstition. Physicians spoke in the language of humus blood, phlegm, yellow bile. Black Byland believed that imbalances in these fluids explained every sickness. Treatments ranged from bloodletting to herbal poultices with a healthy dose of prayer. But when the plague arrived in 1347, those fragile ideas shattered. Doctors, priests, and healers alike stood powerless before the unstoppable tide of death. Their failure to cure or even contain the disease undermined centuries of belief and forced society onto a new path, a slow, painful march toward modern science. The medical world. Before the plague, to understand the transformation, we need to glimpse the state of medicine in the early 14th century. Universities like Bologna, Paris, and Montpellier trained physicians who saw themselves as learned men, distinct from surgeons and They studied Galen's texts written over 1,000 years earlier and applied theories of humors to every ailment. If you suffered a fever, you were said to have an excess of blood. The cure: bloodletting, often with leeches. If you coughed too much, perhaps your phlegm was unbalanced. Treatment might involve purging, diet changes, or breathing certain vapors. Astrology also played a role. Doctors charted the stars to determine auspicious times for treatment. Surgery, meanwhile, was considered a lesser art, practiced by barbers who set bones, drained abscesses, and occasionally performed amputations. Apothecaries sold herbal remedies, powders, and ointments. Religion infused it all. Prayers, blessings, and relics were considered as potent as herbs or knives. This system had worked more or less for centuries. But when plague struck, its inadequacy became glaringly obvious. The plague exposes the limits of medicine. The Black Death killed with terrifying speed. Victims often died within 2 to 3 days, their bodies covered in black swellings. No bloodletting, no herb, no prayer could halt it. Physicians prescribed bizarre treatments, applying pigeon carcasses to buboes, drinking potions made from crushed emeralds, burning aromatic woods to cleanse the air, even ingesting mixtures of urine and dung. Nothing worked. Doctors themselves perished in droves, their knowledge offering no shield. The famous Paris medical faculty, commissioned by King Philip VI in 1348, produced a long treatise blaming the plague on a conjunction of planets and corrupted air. Their advice: avoid bathing, carry sweet-smelling herbs, and stay indoors. Little real protection. Ordinary people quickly lost faith. If learned physicians could not help, perhaps folk healers, wise women, or quacks had better answers. The plague democratized medicine, opening space for voices outside universities. Some cures were harmless herbs, others were dangerous frauds. The rise of superstition: as science faltered, superstition surged. Many saw the plague as divine punishment for humanity's sins. Flagellant movements spread across Europe, bands of men whipping themselves in public, hoping their penance would end God's wrath. Others clung to magical charms, talismans and amulets, inscribed with prayers or astrological symbols. Astrology grew especially powerful. Since doctors had already relied on the stars, many took the plague as cosmic proof. Astrological charts circulated, predicting waves of infection tied to planetary alignments. People timed their movements, treatments, even marriages according to the heavens. But superstition had a darker side. Desperate to explain the inexplicable, communities turned to scapegoats. Jews were accused of poisoning wells. Witches were blamed for summoning plague demons. In some towns, supposed plague spreaders were executed without trial. Medicine, powerless, gave way to hysteria. Seeds of change. Out of this failure came transformation. The plague forced people to question old authorities. If Galen and Hippocrates could not explain the Black Death, perhaps new knowledge was needed. Some physicians began to observe symptoms more carefully, compiling case studies rather than repeating ancient dogma. Italian physician Gentile da Foligno, though he died of plague himself, left detailed notes on bubonic swellings. Others experimented with quarantine, isolation, and protective measures. In Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, authorities pioneered the quarantine system, requiring ships to wait 40 days offshore before entering port. Though rooted in fear, this idea laid the foundation for modern epidemiology. The plague also elevated the role of surgeons. Since many university-trained doctors fled or died, practical healers, the barbers and surgeons, stepped in. They lanced buboes, drained pus, and applied poultices, often with more success than learned physicians. For the first time, hands medicine gained respect. The birth of public health. Another major shift came in the realm of public health. Medieval cities, once content to let individuals manage sickness privately, began imposing community-wide measures. Venice established health boards and patrols to enforce quarantines. Milan, as noted earlier, sealed infected houses. These harsh methods reflected a new understanding. Disease was not only an individual problem, but a collective threat. This was revolutionary. Before, health had been tied to personal sin or divine will. After the plague, it became a matter of governance, a responsibility of rulers. Slowly, the idea of a state role in health took root, an idea we still live with today. Long-term impacts on medicine. The immediate aftermath of the Black Death did not produce modern medicine overnight. Superstition remained strong, astrology thrived, and humoral theory persisted well into the Renaissance. Yet the seeds of science were planted. Greater emphasis on empirical observation rather than authority. Rising prestige for surgeons and practical healers. Early experiments in isolation and prevention. The recognition of disease as a social and political issue. Over the next centuries, these changes blossomed. By the Renaissance, anatomy was studied through dissection, universities began questioning Galen openly, and medicine shifted slowly toward experimentation. In a paradoxical way, the plague, though it destroyed millions, helped destroy the chains of outdated medical dogma. A new relationship with death. Perhaps the most profound medical shift was not technical but philosophical. Medieval medicine had long aimed to restore balance, to keep the body's humors aligned. But after the plague, people realized that death was unavoidable, often sudden, and beyond human mastery. This led to new cultural obsessions, the ars moriendi, or art of dying well, and grim reminders like the Danse Macabre. Doctors, too, adjusted their role. No longer could they promise to save every patient. Instead, they began to focus on comfort, prevention, and practical remedies. Medicine grew humbler, but also more honest. Conclusion: from darkness to dawn, the Black Death devastated medieval medicine, exposing its failures, deepening superstition, and unleashing fraud. Yet in the ashes of that failure lay the roots of progress. By forcing people to doubt ancient authorities, to experiment, and to think collectively about disease, the plague nudged Europe toward a new medical future. It would take centuries for true science to emerge, but without the Black Death, perhaps the breakthroughs of the Renaissance, the discoveries of anatomy, and eventually the triumphs of modern medicine would never have arrived. In its cruelty, the plague became an unintended teacher, reminding humanity that knowledge must evolve, perish. Chapter 13. Faith in Crisis, Religion, Heresy, and the Church's struggle when the Black Death descended upon Europe. It was not just bodies that collapsed under its weight, it was belief itself. For centuries, the Catholic Church had been the immovable pillar of medieval society. It dictated how people lived, how they prayed, how they worked, and even how they thought about death and salvation. But in the face of the plague, the Church's authority cracked. How could the most powerful spiritual institution in Europe, supposedly God's representative on earth, stand helpless before the devastation? Why did prayers fail to stop the dying? Why did holy relics, pilgrimages, and blessings offer no protection? These questions gnawed at the medieval mind, planting seeds of doubt, rebellion, and heresy that would echo for centuries. The Church before the plague. Before 1347, the Catholic Church held near total control over spiritual life in Europe. Priests, bishops, and popes guided the faithful through a rhythm of sacraments: baptism, confession, communion, marriage, and last rites. The Church also wielded vast political power, owning land, levying taxes, and often influencing kings. The promise was simple: obey God's law, respect the Church, and your soul would find eternal rest. Sin could be forgiven, purgatory shortened, and heaven assured through proper devotion. Miracles, relics, and holy sites gave believers tangible access to the divine. In a world of hardship, the Church offered certainty, but certainty dies quickly. When corpses pile in the streets, the silence of God. When plague struck, Europeans turned instinctively to the Church. Priests led processions, monasteries prayed day and night, bells tolled to ward off evil. Pilgrims flocked to holy sites, seeking miraculous cures. Relics, from fragments of the true cross to saints' bones, were paraded through towns as protective charms. Yet still the plague raged. Whole monasteries were wiped out. Priests who tended the sick often died alongside them. In many parishes, there was simply no clergy left to perform burials or last rites. For the faithful, this silence was devastating. If God was merciful, why did he allow children to die? If the Church was his instrument, why was it powerless? Some concluded that the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins. Others suspected the Church itself had lost God's favor. The flight of the clergy. The crisis was worsened by the behavior of many churchmen. While some priests stayed behind, bravely ministering to the dying, others fled. Bishops retreated to their country estates, abandoning towns to fend for themselves. Stories spread of priests demanding exorbitant fees to administer last rites, exploiting desperate families. This hypocrisy enraged ordinary people. At a moment when the Church should have stood strongest, it appeared cowardly and corrupt. Trust, once unshakable, began to crumble. The rise of the flagellants. Into this void stepped radical movements. The most famous were the flagellants, bands of penitents who roamed from town to town, whipping themselves in public as penance for humanity's sins. They believed the plague was God's punishment, and that only through suffering could his wrath be appeased. Crowds gathered to watch their rituals, chanting, crying, and joining in. For many, the flagellants seemed holier, more sincere, than priests who hid in fear. Their popularity threatened church authority, and eventually, the Pope condemned them as heretics. But the damage was done. Faith no longer belonged only to the church, could be claimed by anyone willing to suffer for salvation. Scapegoats and persecution with no clear answers. Religious fear turned outward. Jews, long marginalized in Christian Europe, became easy targets. Rumors spread that Jews had poisoned wells to cause the plague. Pogroms erupted across the continent. Entire communities were massacred, their homes burned, their survivors driven into exile. The church sometimes condemned these killings, but often stood by or even encouraged them. For many Christians, eliminating supposed plague spreaders was a twisted form of holy justice. The plague thus deepened Europe's culture of intolerance, fusing fear with religious violence, mysticism, and new movements amid despair. New forms of spirituality blossomed. Some turned to mystics, men and women claiming direct visions from God. Figures like Catherine of Siena and Bridget of Sweden gained followers, presenting themselves as vessels of divine truth. Their writings and prophecies shaped late medieval piety, emphasizing personal devotion over institutional rituals. This shift marked a quiet revolution. Religion became more individualized, less tied to the hierarchy of priests and bishops. Salvation could be sought in prayer, visions, or private devotion, not only through the church's sacraments. Corruption laid bare. The plague also highlighted the church's deep corruption. With priests dying, parishes were desperate for replacements. Standards fell. Poorly trained or morally unfit men were rushed into positions. Stories circulated of priests drinking, gambling, and living scandalous lives. The spectacle of such corruption, especially in a time of suffering, fueled resentment. Ordinary believers began to ask, if these men represented God, why were they so unworthy? Such doubts would later feed into the Protestant Reformation, but their roots lay in the plague years. The plague and the papacy. The papacy itself was shaken. In Avignon, where the papacy had relocated during the 14th century, Pope Clement VI ordered massive prayers and processions, but also took pragmatic steps. Famously, he consecrated the Rhine River so bodies could be thrown in when cemeteries overflowed. Clement also granted indulgences to all who died of plague, hoping to comfort the faithful. Yet even the Pope was seen as powerless before the disease. The papacy's spiritual prestige dimmed, reduced to a bureaucratic administrator rather than a divine shield. Seeds of heresy and reform by the plague's end. Christianity remained the dominant faith, but it was changed forever. Doubt had entered where once there was certainty. Movements like the Lollards in England and the Hussites in Bohemia would soon challenge the church openly, calling for reform, simplicity, and a return to Scripture. Their cries echoed the disillusionment born during the Black Death. The plague also democratized religion. No longer could the church monopolize salvation. Lay people through mysticism, radical groups, or private devotion claimed their own paths to God. This democratization weakened the church's grip and prepared the way for the religious upheaval of the 16th century. Death, art, and the church's new role culturally. The plague changed how Europeans imagined death and salvation. The Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, appeared in paintings and church murals, showing skeletons leading kings, peasants, and priests alike to the grave. Death spared no one, and salvation seemed more uncertain than ever. Church sermons grew darker, emphasizing the fragility of life and the need for constant repentance. Yet alongside this grimness, there was also a surge of charitable works. Hospitals, orphanages, and chapels built as acts of piety, often by survivors seeking to atone for their sins or to honor lost loved ones. The church adapted, but it was no longer the unquestioned master of souls. Conclusion: a shaken faith. Of Black Death struck at the very heart of medieval faith. The church, once all-powerful, appeared weak and corrupt. New movements, flagellants, mystics, hereticsy, merged to fill the void. Scapegoats were slaughtered, corruption exposed, and doubt seeded. Religion did not die, but it changed. Faith became more personal, more fractured, and more skeptical of authority. The plague's devastation forced Europeans to confront the silence of God, and in doing so, it prepared the way for the Reformation, the Renaissance, and the birth of modern spirituality. The Black Death was not only a medical or social disaster, was a theological earthquake, shaking the very foundations of medieval belief. Chapter 14. The Economic Earthquake, Wages, Wealth, and the Birth of a New World. When the Black Death swept through Europe between 1347 and 1353, it left not only a trail of corpses but also an unprecedented economic upheaval. Entire villages vanished, trade routes faltered, markets collapsed, and farmlands were left untended. But in the ruins of this collapse lay the seeds of transformation, seeds that would eventually grow into the foundations of the modern economy. The plague was a tragedy of unimaginable proportions, but it was also a turning point. For the first time in centuries, ordinary workers found themselves in a position of unexpected power. Nobles, kings, and landowners scrambled to adjust to the new reality, a world where labor was scarce, wages were rising, and the old feudal system began to crack apart. A world of empty fields before the plague. Europe was crowded. The population had boomed in the High Middle Ages, and farmland was stretched thin. Peasants worked endlessly, tied to the estates of their lords, producing just enough to survive. Wages were low, opportunities limited, and famine lurked in the background. But when the Black Death struck, everything changed. With 30 to 60% of the population dead, whole villages were abandoned. Crops rotted in the fields, mills went silent, and livestock wandered unattended. In England alone, historians estimate that nearly half of cultivated land went out of use in the years immediately after the plague. The survivors inherited a different world, one where there was suddenly more land than workers, more resources than hands to use them. The rise of labor power. For centuries, peasants had been trapped in a system of serfdom, bound to their lord's land with little chance of freedom. But the labor shortage changed everything. Lords desperately needed workers to plow their fields, harvest their crops, and tend their herds. Peasants realized they could demand more. If one lord refused to raise wages, another, desperate to save his harvest, would. Laborers began to move freely between estates, abandoning the rigid bonds of feudal loyalty. Some negotiated not just higher wages, but also better living conditions, shorter working hours, and even outright freedom from serfdom. This was nothing short of revolutionary. For the first time, the working poor had leverage. The panic of the nobility, the sudden empowerment of peasants terrified Europe's elites. Lords, who once commanded obedience, now found themselves bargaining with men they had considered little more than property. Governments rushed to respond. In England, King Edward III issued the Statute of Labourers 1351, which attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and forbid workers from leaving their lord's service. Similar laws appeared in France, Italy, and elsewhere, but laws could not change reality. Workers simply ignored them, and enforcement was nearly impossible. In some regions, officials who tried to punish peasants were met with open defiance or violence. The old order was beginning to crumble. Urban growth and new opportunities. The plague also reshaped cities. While many towns were devastated, the survivors discovered new opportunities. Guilds, once tightly controlled, now welcomed newcomers to replace lost members. Craftsmen could command higher pay for their skills, and merchants found themselves able to dominate trade with fewer competitors. In cities like Florence, survivors often inherited property from deceased relatives, creating a new middle class of wealthier artisans and traders. For the first time, upward mobility, once nearly impossible, became a reality for many. This economic dynamism helped fuel the Renaissance. As surplus wealth flowed into art, architecture, and learning, women and the economy. The plague also transformed gender roles. With so many men dead, women entered jobs previously closed to them, running shops, managing estates, even joining guilds. Widows often inherited property and businesses, giving them financial independence. Though society would eventually try to push women back into traditional roles, the Black Death had demonstrated their economic capability. Some historians argue this contributed to the long-term transformation of women's roles in European society. Agriculture transformed. Agriculture was the backbone of medieval Europe, and it too was transformed by the plague. With fewer mouths to feed, marginal lands, hillsides, marshes, or poor soils were abandoned. Farmers concentrated on the most fertile fields, producing higher yields with less labor. At the same time, many shifted from grain farming to pastoral farming, especially sheep. Sheep required fewer workers, and their wool became a major source of wealth, particularly in England. This shift laid the foundation for the powerful textile industry that would dominate European trade in the following centuries. The collapse of serfdom. The greatest economic change was the decline of feudalism. Serfdom had already been weakening, but the plague accelerated its downfall. In Western Europe, many peasants gained their freedom outright, as lords could no longer afford to keep them bound. In Eastern Europe, however, nobles fought back fiercely, tightening their grip on peasants and creating a system known as the Second Serfdom. This divergence would shape Europe's future. The West moved toward freer labor markets and eventually capitalism, while the East sank deeper into feudal oppression, rebellions, and unrest. The clash between rising peasant demands and noble resistance often erupted into violence. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 saw thousands of rebels march on London, demanding an end to serfdom, fair wages, and justice. Though brutally suppressed, the revolt terrified elites and signaled that the working class was no longer willing to suffer silently. Similar uprisings broke out across Europe. From France's Jacquerie, 1358, to revolts in Florence and Flanders, each rebellion was a warning shot. The social contract of the Middle Ages was collapsing. Wealth and the church, too, was caught in the economic upheaval. With fewer priests, those who survived often demanded higher pay. Monasteries, stripped of their members, sometimes rented out their lands for profit. Wealthy survivors endowed new churches and chapels, hoping to secure salvation for themselves and their families. But as the church grew wealthier, resentment grew. Many saw the clergy as greedy, profiting from disaster while the poor struggled. This economic tension deepened the crisis of faith, already described in chapter 13. The birth of a new world. By the late 14th century, Europe was permanently changed. The rigid structures of medieval society had been shaken loose. Peasants had tasted bargaining power. Cities had grown wealthier and more dynamic. Trade networks, though scarred, were recovering, setting the stage for an age of exploration and expansion. The Black Death, in destroying the old economy, created the space for a new one. It broke the chains of feudalism, raised the status of workers, and shifted Europe toward a market-driven capitalist future. Conclusion: from ruin to renaissance. The Black Death was more than a biological disaster. It was an economic earthquake. It toppled centuries-old systems, redistributed wealth, and altered the balance of power between lords and peasants, clergy and laity, men and women. In the short term, it caused chaos, rebellion, and fear. But in the long term, it laid the foundations for the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the modern economic world. From the ashes of plague, Europe would rise, not just scarred, but transformed. Chapter 15. Cultural shockwaves, art, literature, and the obsession with death. When the Black Death tore through Europe, it did not merely shatter populations and economies, it scarred the cultural imagination of an entire civilization. People who survived lived with memories of half-empty villages, mass graves, abandoned churches, and the terrifying silence of a world undone. These memories bled into art, literature, and philosophy, creating a society obsessed with mortality. The cultural response to the plague was not uniform. In some cases, it was deeply spiritual, turning toward prayer and repentance. In others, it was darkly satirical, mocking the futility of human ambition. In still others, it was morbidly creative, producing haunting works of art that remain some of the most chilling in history. The Black Death gave Europe a new visual language of death, a culture that danced with skeletons, painted with skulls, and wrote of despair. And yet, paradoxically, from this obsession with mortality came an explosion of creativity that would fuel the Renaissance. The art of death before the plague. Medieval art was dominated by religious themes, serene Madonnas, radiant saints, and orderly depictions of heaven. But after the plague, a new style emerged, grimmer, more realistic, and more terrifying. Skeletons and rotting corpses began to appear in paintings, frescoes, and manuscripts. Artists portrayed death not as a distant theological idea, but as an immediate, unavoidable presence. One of the most striking motifs was the danse macabre, or the dance of death. These paintings and carvings showed skeletons leading people of all classes, kings, popes, peasants, and children, into the grave. The message was blunt: death spares no one. Wealth, power, and piety offered no protection. Murals of the Danse Macabre decorated church walls, reminding worshippers that the Black Death had humbled even the mightiest. These haunting images were not just art. They were a psychological mirror of Europe's collective trauma. The triumph of death. Another common theme was the triumph of death, a vision of death as an unstoppable army sweeping across the earth. In one famous fresco in Palermo, Sicily, skeletal horsemen ride over piles of the dead while the living flee in terror. Such imagery was not abstract. It was inspired by lived experience. Europeans had seen whole villages erased overnight, processions of carts carrying corpses, and priests dropping dead midsummen. Artists captured these horrors with brutal honesty. This was not art to comfort. It was art to confront. Literature in the shadow of the plague. Just as art grew darker, so too did literature. Writers struggled to make sense of a world turned upside down, producing works that were at once grim, satirical, and deeply human. One of the most famous is Giovanni Boccaccio, Essa de Cameron, 1353, written in Florence during the height of the plague. The book frames itself around 10 young people fleeing the city to escape the disease. While hiding in the countryside, they tell each other tales of love, betrayal, comedy, and tragedy. The Decameron is not only entertaining, it is a cultural document, showing how survivors coped by clinging to storytelling, laughter, and companionship. Yet beneath the humor lies a stark reminder of the horror outside their retreat, a city consumed by death. In contrast, Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written later in England, reflects a similar fascination with human behavior during crisis. Though not about the plague directly, its mix of satire, bawdiness, and moral lessons echoes the shifting values of a society living under the shadow of death. Meanwhile, religious writers penned sermons and moral treatises urging repentance. Many interpreted the plague as divine punishment for sin, and their writings are filled with apocalyptic warnings, visions of hell, and calls for reform. Music of mourning. Even music was transformed. Before the plague, much of medieval music was liturgical, smooth, sacred chants designed for church. After the plague, new compositions emerged, often mournful and dissonant, echoing the trauma of the time. Some hymns became more desperate, pleading for divine mercy. Others embraced the memento mori theme, remember that you must die. These works reminded listeners not to cling too tightly to earthly joys. The soundscape of Europe had changed. Music was no longer just praise. It was lament. Architecture. Fear architecture, too, bore the plague's mark. While cathedrals and churches continued to rise, their decorations often carried plague motifs, grim carvings, skeletal figures, and warnings of judgment. But architecture also reflected the practical response to death. Cemeteries were expanded, ossuaries, bone houses were built, and plague pits became permanent landmarks. Entire chapels were dedicated to plague saints, like Saint Sebastian and Saint Roch, whom people believed offered divine protection. Even city planning changed. Narrow, crowded streets that once fueled disease began to be reconsidered, laying the groundwork for later improvements in sanitation and urban design. Philosophy and the crisis of meaning. Perhaps the deepest cultural shockwave was philosophical. The Black Death shook people's faith not only in the church, but in the very meaning of life. Scholars asked questions that had been suppressed for centuries. If God was good, why did he allow such suffering? Was the plague divine punishment, or simply nature? Could human reason, not prayer, explain disease? These questions planted seeds of skepticism that would later blossom in the Renaissance and Enlightenment. For some, the plague deepened piety. For others, it led to despair, even hedonism. Contemporary accounts describe people who abandoned all restraint, indulging in drinking, gambling, and lust, convinced that tomorrow they would die. This oscillation between religious fervor and nihilistic pleasure defined the cultural mood of the late Middle Ages. The morbid fascination with skulls. One of the most enduring cultural legacies of the Black Death was the skull as a symbol. Skulls began to appear everywhere in paintings, sculptures, jewelry, and even prayer books. They were reminders that beneath flesh, all humans were the same. This fascination with mortality, known as memento mori, became central to European art and thought. To live wisely, people believed, one must always remember death. Ironically, this obsession with death gave birth to new artistic creativity. By confronting mortality so directly, artists and writers produced some of the most powerful works of the medieval period. Humor in the face of death. Not all cultural responses were grim. Humor, satire, and parody also flourished. Jokes about doctors, clergy, and nobles became common, reflecting both resentment and a way of coping. Then in some plays, death itself was portrayed as a trickster mocking human pride. The plague may have broken Europe, but it also gave people a new resilience, the ability to laugh in the face of despair. From death to Renaissance. By the late 14th century, Europe's obsession with death began to shift. While the plague continued to strike in waves, its initial shock had faded. Survivors now carried not only trauma, but also new perspectives. The realism of plague art evolved into the humanism of Renaissance painting. The satirical storytelling of Boccaccio and Chaucer laid foundations for modern literature. The questioning of faith paved the way for philosophy, science, and reform. In short, the cultural trauma of the Black Death became the soil from which Europe's rebirth would grow. Conclusion: living with death. The Black Death etched death into Europe's cultural DNA. It turned skeletons into symbols, mass graves into monuments, and fear into creativity. Art grew darker, literature more satirical, philosophy more questioning. But in facing mortality so directly, Europeans gained something unexpected: a deeper appreciation for life, beauty, and knowledge. The plague left scars but also a legacy of resilience, creativity, and transformation. From death came culture. From despair came Renaissance. Chapter 16: Medicine in the Shadow of Death. Doctors, plague masks, and desperate cures. The Black Death was not just a tragedy of numbers, it was a crisis of knowledge. When the plague first struck, medieval Europe had no scientific framework. To understand disease, germ theory would not emerge for centuries. Instead, physicians, scholars, and common folk reached for whatever explanations they could find, often blending superstition, astrology, and fragments of ancient medical theory. The result was a fascinating mixture of desperate experimentation, wild imagination, and occasional innovation. Medicine, in the shadow of the Black Death, became a theater of hope and horror. At the heart of medieval medicine was the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. This idea, inherited from Hippocrates and Galen, claimed that health depended on the balance of these fluids. When plague victims erupted with blackened swellings, buboes under the arms and groin, doctors often explained it as an excess of black bile. Treatments, therefore, aimed to restore balance. Bloodletting was common, in which physicians opened a vein or applied leeches to drain the poison. Others prescribed purges with vomiting and laxatives, hoping to flush out the corruption within. Some doctors lanced the buboes themselves, draining pus in the belief it might relieve suffering. In reality, these methods often hastened death. The most iconic image of plague medicine is the plague doctor's mask, a long-beaked contraption filled with herbs, flowers, and vinegar-soaked cloth. This strange costume, complete with long robes and a staff, was not just for show, reflected a genuine theory. Many believed the plague spread through miasma, or corrupted air. By breathing through aromatic herbs, plague doctors hoped to filter out the deadly vapor. In practice, the outfit probably offered some protection, as the heavy leather and glass goggles reduced contact with infected fleas or bodily fluids. But for medieval eyes, the plague doctor was both a figure of dread and comforter, half-priest, half-surgeon, walking symbol of death itself. Astrology also played a surprising role in medicine. Learned physicians consulted the stars, claiming that the conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars had corrupted the air and triggered the pestilence. Horoscopes were drawn to predict outbreaks, and treatments were sometimes timed according to celestial movements. For the deeply religious, however, this astronomical reasoning mingled uneasily with divine punishment. Some argued the plague was God's wrath, and thus no earthly cure could succeed. Only prayer, fasting, and repentance would heal the world. Yet, not all medical efforts were hopeless. Herbal remedies offered some relief. Plants like rue, sage, lavender, and rosemary were used in poultices or burned to purify the air. Vinegar, garlic, and onions were applied to buboes. Physicians also advised simple hygiene practices, such as avoiding overcrowded places, bathing in vinegar water, and cleaning homes with strong-smelling herbs. Though crude, these measures sometimes reduced flea infestations, making them accidentally effective. In certain monasteries, where cleanliness and isolation were better enforced, survival rates were noticeably higher. Quarantine became one of the most significant medical innovations of the age. In the city of Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, authorities required ships to wait for 30 days before docking, a period later extended to 40, giving us the word quarantine from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. Though people did not fully understand contagion, the practice worked, slowing the spread of infection. Venice soon adopted the system, building lazarettos, or plague hospitals, on islands to isolate the sick. This approach marked one of the earliest examples of organized public health policy in Europe. Of course, medicine was not only the realm of university-trained doctors. Folk healers, midwives, and village-wise women offered remedies drawn from oral tradition. Charms and amulets were worn to ward off evil spirits. Some carried dried toads, believing they absorbed poison. Others wore rubies or emeralds, which were thought to repel illness. Prayer scrolls, saints, relics, and holy water were also popular cures. To modernize, these may seem absurd, but in a time of terror, such objects offered comfort and perhaps, in some cases, placebo relief. The plague also exposed medicine's limits, leading to social unrest. Doctors often fled cities along with priests and nobles, leaving the poor abandoned. This bred resentment and fueled the rise of alternative healers. At the same time, the very failure of medicine planted the seeds of change. People began to doubt the ancient reliance on humors and astrology. Over time, careful observation, watching symptoms, tracking spread, noting survival patterns, would pave the way for more scientific approaches. In some sense, the Black Death forced medicine to confront reality, even if answers were centuries away. One of the strangest legacies of plague medicine is how it blurred the line between science and theater. Plague doctors in their bird-like masks became cultural icons, feared and mocked alike. Remedies ranged from herbal poultices to magical rituals, from bloodletting to bathing in rosewater. Behind it all was the desperate human desire to act, to do something, in the face of unstoppable death. And while many treatments failed, a few innovations, quarantine, herbal hygiene, protective clothing, offered real hope, showing that even in darkness, fragments of progress could emerge. The Black Death was thus both the graveyard and the classroom of medieval medicine. It revealed the deep flaws of traditional theory, but it also inspired practical experiments that would echo into the Renaissance and beyond. In the shadow of death, medicine stumbled, but it also began, slowly, to awaken. Chapter 17. The Plague and the Church. Faith tested by death. When the Black Death swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, it did not only attack it attacked faith itself. For centuries, the Church had been the spiritual backbone of medieval life. People looked to priests for salvation, monks for learning, and the Pope for ultimate authority. But when the plague struck, killing rich and poor alike, the Church faced a crisis unlike any in its history. How could an institution that claimed to hold the keys to heaven explain or withstand a disaster that seemed to come directly from hell? From the earliest days of the plague, many interpreted it as divine punishment. Chroniclers wrote that God had unleashed the pestilence as retribution for human sins, greed, pride, heresy, and corruption. Preachers thundered sermons about wrath and repentance, urging people to confess, fast, and humble themselves before God. Some communities staged public processions of penitence, carrying relics, chanting prayers, and begging for mercy. The belief that spiritual failure had caused the plague was so strong that entire towns organized collective acts of atonement. But despite these efforts, the deaths continued, and the silence of heaven grew deafening. This silence shook trust in the Church. Priests and monks, who were expected to comfort the sick and bury the dead, often fled their parishes to save themselves. Bishops closed cathedral doors, and even monasteries barred entry. The higher clergy retreated to safety, leaving ordinary people abandoned. When priests did stay, they often became victims themselves, since administering last rites and handling burials exposed them directly to infection. Some towns lost nearly their entire clerical staff. The result was a devastating spiritual vacuum. People no longer saw the Church as a shield against death, but as just another powerless institution crumbling under the plague's weight. Into this vacuum stepped movements of religious extremism. The most dramatic of these were the bands of men roamed from town to town, dressed in simple robes, whipping themselves in public squares, while singing hymns of repentance. They believed that through their suffering, they could atone for humanity's sins and end the plague. Crowds often gathered to watch them, inspired by their raw devotion. At first, the church tolerated them, but their popularity quickly grew dangerous. The Pope condemned them as heretics, fearing they undermined church authority. Still, for a time, the flagellants embodied the desperation of an age where traditional prayers seemed powerless. The plague also intensified the persecution of minorities. Many Christians, searching for someone to blame, turned their anger against Jewish communities. Rumors spread that Jews had poisoned wells or conspired to spread the pestilence. In towns across Germany, Switzerland, and France, mobs massacred entire Jewish populations, burning them alive or driving them into exile. Though some rulers and even the Pope issued edicts protecting Jews, these often failed to stop local violence. The Church, already weakened, was unable to fully control the chaos. These persecutions remain among the darkest legacies of the Black Death, fueled by fear, ignorance, and broken trust. At the same time, the plague reshaped religious practices. Burial customs changed dramatically. With so many dead, elaborate funerals were abandoned. Mass graves replaced churchyard burials, stripping away the dignity of centuries-old rituals. Priests, when available, often performed abbreviated rites over dozens of bodies at once. This loss of sacred ceremony left many survivors feeling spiritually abandoned. Their grief compounded by the absence of proper farewells. Monasteries, long the centers of knowledge and devotion, suffered especially heavy losses. In some cases, entire monastic communities were wiped out. The intellectual and spiritual leadership that monasteries had provided for centuries crumbled. This left a lasting wound on the Church's cultural authority, reducing its dominance over education and scholarship. Ironically, the weakening of monasteries also created opportunities for new forms of learning, paving the way for universities and secular knowledge in the Renaissance. The plague also sowed seeds of doubt. If God had sent the disease, why did the innocent suffer alongside the wicked? Why did prayers, pilgrimages, and confessions fail to stop the deaths? These questions quietly eroded blind obedience to church authority, though few openly challenged. The Church in the 14th century, the seeds of skepticism were planted. Over the next 2 centuries, they would blossom into open reform movements, culminating in the Protestant Reformation. In this sense, the plague was a silent architect of future religious upheaval. And yet, faith did not disappear. In many ways, it adapted. People turned to local saints, relics, and miracle shrines, searching for divine protection closer to home. The cult of saints flourished, with pilgrims traveling to venerate relics, believed to ward off disease. Popular spirituality became more personal, more emotional, and less dependent on distant church officials. Art and literature reflected this, shifts depicting macabre scenes of death and judgment that urged individuals to prepare their souls for eternity. The Church, weakened but not destroyed, eventually tried to reassert its authority. Councils were called, new orders were founded, and stricter regulations on priests were enforced. But the scars remained. The Black Death had exposed the Church's vulnerability, showing that even the most sacred institutions could falter in the face of nature's fury. For the people who lived through it, faith was no longer a shield, but a trembling candle in the wind. Thus, the plague transformed religion as profoundly as it transformed society. It shattered confidence in established authority, inspired fanaticism and persecution, and forced individuals to seek new ways of understanding God's will. In the silence of unanswered prayers, medieval faith shifted, reshaped by death into something darker, more personal, and ultimately more questioning. Chapter 18. The Black Death and the Collapse of Social Order. The arrival of the Black Death in Europe did not only shatter families and decimate populations, it also tore apart the fragile threads of medieval social order. For centuries, society had been structured in a rigid hierarchy. Kings and nobles ruled, peasants labored, the clergy guided souls, and merchants kept commerce alive. Each class had its role, and though tensions often simmered beneath the surface, the system remained stable. The plague, however, upended this delicate balance. Death showed no respect for rank or wealth, and in its wake, the foundations of medieval order began to crack. At the heart of this collapse was sheer mortality. Some regions lost over half of their population in a matter of months. Entire villages vanished, fields lay untended, and cities emptied as people fled or died. Labor, once abundant, suddenly became the most precious commodity in Europe. Surviving peasants and workers realized their worth had skyrocketed. Landlords, desperate to keep their estates productive, offered higher wages and better conditions. This was a radical shift in power. For centuries, peasants had lived in servitude under feudal obligations, but now, the scarcity of labor gave them leverage they had never known. The ruling elite, horrified at this new reality, fought to maintain control. Laws were passed to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. In England, the infamous Statute of Labourers 1351 attempted to force peasants back into their old roles, forbidding them from seeking better pay elsewhere. Yet such measures often failed. Workers simply moved to regions where landlords were willing to break the law to secure labour. The feudal system, already strained, began to collapse under this economic pressure. The Black Death, in this sense, was not just a biological disaster, it was a revolution in disguise. With social mobility rising, resentment toward authority also grew. Peasants who had endured generations of poverty now saw glimpses of freedom, only to have it restricted by kings and nobles. This tension boiled over in violent uprisings. The most famous of these was the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England, where thousands of commoners rose against the crown, demanding an end to serfdom and oppressive taxation. Though brutally suppressed, the revolt symbolized the growing unrest unleashed by the plague. Across Europe, similar rebellions erupted, challenging both secular and ecclesiastical authority. Meanwhile, the plague reshaped family life and gender roles. With men dying in massive numbers, women were often left to manage farms, businesses, and households alone. Many widows gained new independence, inheriting property, and even running guild workshops in cities. Though society remained patriarchal, the plague created cracks in gender boundaries, giving women opportunities they would not have had otherwise. The image of a strictly male-dominated society began to soften, even if temporarily. Cities faced chaos as well. Law and order broke down when authorities fled or died. In Florence, Venice, and Paris, reports describe streets littered with corpses, homes abandoned, and markets empty. Thieves looted houses, and gangs roamed unchecked. With death around every corner, fear drove people to desperate acts. Some turned inward, barricading themselves at home, while others indulged in reckless hedonism, adopting the philosophy of eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Morality itself seemed suspended, as traditional rules lost their power in a world dominated by plague. The nobility, too, suffered humiliation. Though castles provided some protection, the plague still reached the heart. Upon kings, queens, and nobles died alongside peasants. This loss of invincibility damaged the mystique of aristocracy. If divine right truly protected rulers, why had they fallen as easily as commoners? The illusion of superiority cracked, and in its place grew a sense that all humans were equally vulnerable before death. This psychological leveling of society contributed to the erosion of feudal hierarchies. Another destabilizing factor was the movement of people. Refugees fled infected cities, spreading chaos to the countryside. Some villages barred entry to outsiders, while others turned violently against strangers. Trade routes were disrupted, markets collapsed, and famine often followed. In this climate of instability, social trust disintegrated. Communities fractured under suspicion, neighbors turned against one another, and solidarity gave way to survivalism. Yet amid the collapse, opportunities arose for those who survived. With so much land abandoned, peasants could claim deserted farms. Merchants who survived found less competition and greater profits. Skilled artisans rose in prominence, fueling a slow economic recovery that eventually laid the groundwork for a more dynamic Europe. The plague thus paradoxically destroyed and created, sweeping away the old while planting seeds for the new. Religious institutions, as seen in earlier chapters, lost credibility during the crisis, and this spiritual vacuum further destabilized society. Many turned to fringe movements, heresies, or personal devotion outside church control. This fractured religious unity, creating further tensions that would echo for centuries. Society was not only reordered socially and economically, but spiritually as well. By the time the first great wave of plague subsided, Europe was no longer the same. The carefully ordered medieval hierarchy had been shaken to its core. Peasants had tasted leverage, women had tasted independence, nobles had tasted vulnerability, and the church had tasted failure. The Black Death, in all its horror, had accelerated a transformation that might otherwise have taken centuries. The collapse of social order was not just a story of death, but of rebirth. Out of chaos emerged a new Europe, one in which old bonds of feudalism weakened, individuality strengthened, and the seeds of modernity began to take root. The plague had been merciless, but it had also forced society to reinvent itself. Chapter 19. The Black Death, and the transformation of medicine. When the Black Death swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, it struck with such speed and ferocity that the medical systems of the medieval world crumbled almost overnight. Physicians, surgeons, and herbalists had long relied on traditions passed down from ancient Greece, Rome, and the Arab world, but none of their knowledge seemed sufficient against a disease that killed within days. The plague became not only a biological catastrophe but also a crucible in which the very foundations of medicine were tested, reshaped, and, in time, transformed. At the time of the first outbreak in 1347, the dominant medical theory in Europe rested on the humoral system, developed by Hippocrates and Galen centuries earlier. According to this belief, the human body contained four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was thought to be a matter of balance, and disease was seen as an imbalance caused by diet, environment, or spiritual influences. Physicians prescribed bleeding, purging, and diet changes to restore harmony. Yet when confronted with the Black Death, these treatments proved disastrously ineffective. Patients bled and weakened, poultices festered, and prayers went unanswered. The sheer scale of failure forced both doctors and patients to question medical authority. Many physicians themselves perished, either from exposure to the sick, or from ineffective protective measures. Those who survived often abandoned their posts, unwilling to risk their lives for treatments that seemed useless. This collapse of professional medicine created space for alternatives. Herbalists, folk healers, midwives, and even charlatans filled the vacuum, offering remedies ranging from garlic and vinegar potions to talismans and charms. Medicine became more experimental, chaotic, and desperate. One of the most enduring images of plague medicine is the plague doctor, dressed in a long waxed robe, gloves, and a bird-like mask with a long beak stuffed with herbs and spices. While this costume became more common in later outbreaks of plague, it symbolized medieval attempts to fight disease through both physical protection and spiritual symbolism. The herbs in the mask were meant to purify the air, based on the theory of miasma, the belief that disease spread through poisonous vapors. Although incorrect, this idea drove cities to improve sanitation, clear waste, and introduce rudimentary quarantines. Ironically, these practices sometimes did help reduce the spread of plague. Even if the reasoning behind them was flawed, quarantine itself was one of the most revolutionary medical practices to emerge during this period. The city of Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, Croatia, pioneered the idea in 1377, requiring ships from plague-infected ports to wait for 40 days, 40 giorni, before docking. This practice spread across Europe, laying the foundation for public health systems. For the first time, governments began to intervene directly in medicine, regulating movement, isolating the sick, and even organizing pest houses for treatment. Though crude, these measures marked a shift from purely individual care to collective responsibility for health. The failures of traditional medicine also forced greater attention on the writings of Arabic scholars such as Avicenna and Ibn al-Khatib, who had advanced medical thought far beyond Europe in earlier centuries. In the Islamic world, plague was also devastating, but Muslim physicians preserved an expanded knowledge of contagion, sanitation, and pharmacology. European scholars, desperate for answers, translated and studied these works, planting seeds of medical progress that would blossom in the Renaissance. Still, not all lessons were progressive. In many cases, fear and ignorance bred superstition. Some believed plague was punishment from God, and so flagellant movements spread across Europe. Groups of penitents marched through towns, whipping themselves in hopes of divine mercy. Others, a CCUSED, marginalized communities, especially Jews, of poisoning wells or spreading disease. These scapegoats were persecuted, massacred, or expelled, demonstrating how medical failure could fuel social violence. Medicine, in this sense, became entangled with religion, politics, and fear. Yet amid the devastation, the plague also advanced the profession of surgery. Surgeons, often regarded as less prestigious than university-trained physicians, gained credibility because they dealt with practical realities of wounds, abscesses, and infections. Some plague victims developed buboes, large, swollen lymph nodes that surgeons lanced in attempts to drain the poison. Though rarely successful, these procedures showed an early willingness to experiment with anatomy and hands-on treatment, paving the way for later scientific approaches. Another unexpected transformation was in medical writing. The plague generated an explosion of plague tracts, pamphlets, and manuscripts in which physicians documented symptoms, treatments, and theories. Though filled with errors, these texts circulated widely, creating a shared medical dialogue across Europe. For the first time, medicine became a subject of public debate, rather than an exclusive domain of scholars. Knowledge was democratized, albeit unevenly, and the foundation was laid for future scientific discourse. The psychological impact of the Black Death also influenced how medicine was perceived. Many survivors lost faith in doctors and turned instead to religion, mysticism, or personal experimentation. This erosion of trust forced physicians to adapt, becoming more accountable and practical. The plague had shown that lofty theories meant little if they could not save lives. Slowly, medicine began to shift from philosophy toward observation, from theory to practice. By the 15th century, Europe was emerging from the shadow of the first great plague waves, but medicine was not the same as before. Quarantine had become institutionalized, public health had gained legitimacy, surgery had risen in respectability. The humoral system still dominated, but cracks had formed, and within a century, new discoveries in anatomy and science would topple it entirely. The Black Death had not only killed millions, it had forced medicine to evolve. In the end, the plague revealed a paradox. It devastated human bodies but strengthened human knowledge. By exposing the limits of medieval medicine, it cleared the path for progress. The suffering of the 14th century became the crucible from which modern medicine slowly emerged. In the darkest hours of disease, the seeds of healing were planted. Chapter 20. The Black Death, the legacy that shaped the modern world. The Black Death was not merely a pandemic. It was an event so colossal that it shattered the medieval world and reshaped the course of human history. By the time its first great wave ebbed in the mid-14th century, nearly 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population had perished. Entire families disappeared. Villages were abandoned. Cities fell silent. The social, economic, and cultural consequences were so immense that historians today still describe the plague as one of the turning points that ended the medieval age and ushered in the modern world. When the plague first struck, it seemed like nothing more than a nightmare sent from God. But as time passed, people realized that the devastation had transformed society itself. Survivors inherited abandoned lands, houses, and businesses. Fields once left fallow were redistributed, and peasants who had previously been bound to their lords through serfdom suddenly found themselves with leverage. With so few workers remaining, labor became valuable. For the first time in centuries, common people could demand wages, mobility, and freedom. The plague, in its cruelty, had cracked the rigid social hierarchies of feudal Europe. This new reality gave birth to peasant revolts across Europe. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was fueled by demands for fair wages and the abolition of serfdom. Though brutally suppressed, it marked a shift in the balance of power. Lords and kings could no longer take the laboring classes for granted. Across the continent, wages rose, living standards improved for survivors, and a new sense of social mobility emerged. The Black Death had shaken the very foundations of medieval society, breaking the chains that bound millions to poverty. Economically, the plague triggered both disaster and innovation. Trade networks initially collapsed, but as recovery began, new opportunities emerged. Entire industries shifted. Textile production, agriculture, and trade routes adapted to the new realities of a smaller population. Ports like Venice, Florence, and Genoa rebuilt their power, creating the wealth that would fuel the Renaissance. Banking families, such as the Medici, rose in this turbulent aftermath, reshaping Europe's financial systems. In many ways, the Black Death was the dark soil in which the seeds of capitalism were planted. The intellectual and cultural effects were equally profound. The plague had exposed the limits of medieval explanations. Religious, medical, and philosophical faith was shaken. Priests who fled or died left congregations feeling abandoned. The Church, once the unquestioned center of life, was increasingly seen as vulnerable, fallible, even corrupt. In its place, new ideas began to stir. Humanism, the foundation of the Renaissance, flourished partly because the plague had forced people to confront their mortality and seek meaning in life itself rather than in distant promises of salvation. Art and literature bore the scars of the Black Death. Painters filled canvases with grim depictions of death, skeletons, dancing corpses, and haunting memento mori reminders that life was fleeting. Writers such as Giovanni Boccaccio in the Decameron described the horrors of the plague, but also the resilience of human spirit in times of despair. This fascination with death and the macabre became a defining feature of late medieval and early Renaissance culture. The plague made art darker, more honest, and more deeply human. Medicine, too, carried forward the lessons of the plague. Quarantine, laws, health boards, and pest houses became permanent fixtures in European cities. Governments began taking responsibility for public health in ways never before seen. Though the true cause of plague, the bacterium Yersinia pestis, spread by fleas and rats, would not be understood until centuries later. The Black Death marked the first great experiment in organized epidemic response. Without realizing it, medieval Europe had taken its first steps toward modern epidemiology. The plague also reshaped religion in complex ways. While some lost faith in the Church, others turned to mysticism, personal piety, or radical sex. Flagellants, who whipped themselves in penance, revealed a deep spiritual hunger for answers. At the same time, apocalyptic thinking surged, with many believing the end of the world was near. Yet, paradoxically, this very disillusionment with old structures opened the door to reformation. Within 2 centuries, Martin Luther would challenge the Catholic Church, and the Protestant Reformation would forever alter Europe's spiritual map. The roots of that upheaval can be traced back to the cracks opened by the Black Death. Global consequences were no less significant. The plague was not confined to Europe. It spread across Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa, destabilizing empires, cities, and trade routes. In China, the Yuan dynasty struggled under the combined weight of plague, famine, and rebellion, paving the way for the rise of the Ming dynasty. In the Islamic world, cities like Cairo and Damascus saw enormous population losses, weakening cultural and political institutions. The plague was a world event, a truly global catastrophe that reshaped civilizations far beyond Europe. Even centuries later, the memory of the Black Death lingered. Later outbreaks, smaller but still deadly, returned in waves across Europe and Asia until the 18th century. Each time, they revived old fears and reinforced the lessons of quarantine and public health. The shadow of the 14th century pandemic loomed over every generation that followed, and yet, the ultimate legacy of the Black Death is not only one of death, but of transformation. It destroyed lives, but it also destroyed systems of oppression. It tore apart the medieval world, but in the ruins, it cleared space for the Renaissance, the Reformation, and eventually, the scientific revolution. It reminded humanity of its fragility, but also of its resilience. Out of unimaginable suffering came a reshaped world, one that slowly, painfully, and irreversibly stepped toward modernity. Today, as we reflect on pandemics in our own era, the story of the Black Death is both a warning and a reminder. A warning of how fragile human societies are when faced with invisible enemies, and a reminder of how, even in the darkest of times, change, progress, and renewal are possible. The plague was not just a medieval tragedy. It was the crucible in which the modern world was forged. The shadows of the past never truly fade. They wait for those brave enough to seek them. If this story pulled you into the darkness, don't forget to like this video, comment your thoughts, and share it with others who crave the hidden truths of history. And remember, every day, new secrets rise from the ashes of time. Make sure you're part of the journey. Subscribe now, and keep your torch lit. This is Dark History, where the past is never truly dead.